Chapter 201. Sorcerer's Camp. In a dark and gloomy stone room, there were 7 or 8 white stone tables in the empty hall, and on each of the tables were strangely shaped human and monster specimens. At the edge of the stone table, there were 2 to 3 magi, solemnly dissecting the specimens on the stone table. On a stone platform closest to the door of the stone room, a naked, muscular man was lying on his back. His entire body, from the lower jaw to the lower part of his throat to his crotch, was completely spread out like a book. The bright red flesh, the flowing blood, and the ferocious-looking sorcerer created an indescribably eerie atmosphere in the stone room. This man had a lion's nose, short black hair, square cheeks, and bronze skin that was full of luster. Looking at his bulging muscles and thick bone granules, it was obvious that he was a strength-type warrior who had undergone high-intensity training all year round. There was also a sword and shield tattoo on his left shoulder. If it were a local who was familiar with the customs of the night plane, they would definitely scream out in shock. This strong man who was being dissected was an official demon hunter knight. 3 sorcerers surrounded him. A sorcerer was using a sharp scalpel and a small saw to remove a bloody organ from the demon hunter's body, while the assistant sorcerer was casting spells to preserve the fresh organs and put them into containers filled with a dark red liquid. The 3rd sorcerer was writing and drawing on a piece of parchment paper, recording in detail the abnormalities they found in specimen number 1. The demon hunter knight's body was still twitching as the dissecting sorcerer's scalpel gently pricked and stimulated by electric currents. The tip of his little finger was even twitching nervously. This meant that even though the demon hunter knight's internal organs were almost completely removed, his spiritual consciousness still existed, and he seemed to be able to feel the pain in his body. Test specimen number 1, demon hunter knight, male, healthy, 32 years old. His organs are 89% similar to a normal human. Some organs have a slight tendency to mutate. Upper limbs have large bone granules, skin is tough and tight, the strength of the flesh has reached the standard of a high-level apprentice, the heart, liver, and other internal organs have been found to have the tendency to assimilate and mutate with the foreign energy. The mutating effect is equivalent to that of magic organs. There are signs of excessive consumption of life energy. Initial suspicion is that it's caused by the erosion of foreign energy. Detection spells indicate that the test subject does not possess innate elemental abilities. The preliminary conclusion is that the demon hunter knights have signs of both beginner body refinement and beginner demonification. In essence, they are more like human knights who have used runic energy to strengthen their bodies. Since they don't have any elemental talent, the rune energy is strengthening their body, but it is also rapidly consuming their life force. On a nearby stone platform, the demon hunter knight's common mount, the demon colt, was also lying quietly on it. Its body had been cut into pieces. The sorcerers who participated in the dissection all revealed looks of disdain towards this magic colt. It was too primitive, too simple. The so-called devil colts were just hybrids between human warhorses and some special wild beast. Then, during the process of raising and feeding them, they were constantly fed with drugs that stimulated the strength of their flesh and blood. This gave them some of the characteristics of jungle beasts, and their climbing ability was especially strong. Therefore, they became the standard battle mount of the demon hunter knight. In the depths of the dark stone room, the ones placed on the stone platform were no longer ordinary demon hunter knight. Instead, they were more valiant magic breaker knight. However, at this moment, they had all become the evil sorcerer's test subjects. The deepest secrets hidden in their bodies were all revealed in a single glance. Compared to the ordinary demon hunter knights, the magic breaker knights who had successfully advanced had signs of innate elemental abilities. Moreover, some of their main physiological organs had been irreversibly demonized. Strictly speaking, the Magic Breaker Knights were a group of people who had talent in spellcasting but were forcibly turned into Magic Knight. Based on the known data, the sorcerers could not help but speculate that the Grade 4 Holy Knight who stood at the peak of the night plane must have an even more outstanding elemental talent. Unfortunately, he did not embark on the path of a spellcaster, but the path of a magic knight. If this speculation was correct, it would mean that the Grade 4 Holy Knight was no more than a half-baked sorcerer who had gone astray. Of course, with the lack of elemental energy in this plane, it was understandable that he had given up on the path of a sorcerer and embarked on the path of a magic knight. After all, the development of the plane was not complete or abnormal, and it was not something a native of this plane could control. To be honest, to be able to break through to Grade 4 in such a small plane with such a lack of elemental energy, his talent and potential were simply amazing. From the data collected from the dissected test subjects, it could be seen that the ordinary demon hunter knights were just a group of half-baked magic knights who had been infected by rune energy. Their strength was basically equivalent to that of an intermediate to advanced sorcerer apprentice. The Grade 1 Magic Breaker Knights, on the other hand, were a group of real magic knights. Their physique was similar to that of a quasi-sorcerer in the sorcerer world, but with the help of rune equipment, they had sorcerer-level attack and defense. This was also why the Magic Breaker Knights were always at a disadvantage in actual combat, even though they were of the same rank as sorcerers. One had to admit that the night plane was a small plane. It had gone through thousands of years of development and evolution. Although it had nurtured its own unique power system, it was still far inferior to the sorcerer world in terms of rank and strength. In the Greenland forest, the wandering level 1 sorcerers dared to ambush the team of knights led by the Magic Breaker Knight. This showed the huge difference in rank and strength between the two sides. On one side was a large plane with a terrifying reputation that resounded throughout the multiverse. On the other side was a small, isolated, and weak material plane. These two different planes seemed to have the same definition of a level 1 life form on the surface, but when they were put together, there was a huge difference in strength. Of course, the sorcerers spent so much effort to dissect and study the demon hunter knights not only to collect information and data, but also to cultivate the most suitable plague and virus for the demon hunter knight. As the only native force in the night plane that could fight against the sorcerers, as long as the demon hunter knights were eliminated, the remaining indigenous people would not be able to fight against the sorcerers who had mastered the ultimate power. Thousands of human troops were a joke in front of the sorcerers. A simple plague spell could turn a large country into a country of death in a month or two. Without the protection of extraordinary power, the power of mortals was nothing in front of the sorcerers. So, right below the stone chamber, a large worm farm and a runic energy research room had been built. With a large number of demon hunter knights' flesh and blood samples, a special plague worm that fed on runic energy was being cultivated. Once the worm plan was successful, the sorcerers might be able to kill the group of abominable demon hunter knights who prevented them from taking over this plane without bloodshed. At the same time, the construction of the Sorcerer Tower was advancing rapidly. At present, the construction of the Sorcerer Tower had been completed for the first 4 floors, and the top of the tower was about to extend out of the coverage of the illusory barrier. Therefore, in view of the current situation, follow-up construction activities had to be suspended, and they were prepared to wait for the situation to calm down before continuing. Due to the special nature of the construction of the Sorcerer Tower, it was impossible to complete the construction of the floors one by one. The main body of the Sorcerer Tower had to be completed before the engraving of the spell formations could be done, and then all the spell formations would be combined into a complete tower defense system. If necessary, a large-scale sorcerer ceremony would be needed to activate the tower spirit to complete the integration of the entire War Wizard Tower's resources. Such a complicated task could not be completed under the nose of the enemy. Therefore, in order to increase their chances of victory, the sorcerers had to resort to their old tricks, which were voodoo. Grimm stood alone on the top of a high cliff, quietly looking down at the dark forest hidden under the thick night sky. Dark clouds covered the sky, and the stars and moon were dim. This was a great night to kill. Just as he stood there quietly, for visible elemental disturbances had occurred in the forest near and far. The most violent one even blew up half of the mountain top. Even Grim, who was 30 miles away, could feel the heat waves from the raging elemental flames. The shock waves blew off his hood, revealing his calm and stern face. The 4 explosions of elemental disturbances did not occur at the same place, but in 4 different areas. The frequency of each explosion was different, and the elemental auras contained within were also slightly different. With the AI chip's efficient data collection and information comparison ability, Grim could even deduce the identity of the Magi involved in the battle through the elemental auras carried by the wind. The one fighting 7 miles to the southwest was the demonic worm in tech. It had to be said that his strength had improved by leaps and bounds over this period of time. Out of the 4 night raids, the battlefield he was in was the most silent, and the elemental auras that he could identify were the least. If not for Grim's great foresight and the AI chip's powerful abilities, he might have overlooked the aftershocks of his battle. A battle had also erupted 15 miles to the east, between the body-tempering Magus Keel and 2 Magic Breaker Knight. The 2 Magic Breaker Knights had paid the price of 1 death and 1 serious injury before retreating from the battlefield. Keel had also suffered some injuries, and could only let go of the injured knight. Grim could not help but feel sorry for him, and secretly passed this good news to Mary, who was wandering in the forest far away. The battle 30 miles to the northeast was the most intense. The Magic Breaker Knight who had been forced into a dead end had self-destructed. As for the method of self-destruction, it was similar to Nianti's. Grim could not help but wonder if all the Magic Breaker Knights had mastered this annoying method of self-destruction. The one who had forced the Magic Breaker Knight to self-destruct was a strange magus called Marionette, who seemed to be able to control other people's bodies. However, the first 3 battles were not the focus of Grim's attention. The only thing he was concerned about was the battle 45 miles to the northwest. Chapter 202. In the previous battle, 3 wizards had died to the sneak attacks of the Radiant Knight. This was a huge loss for the Salubo family. After all, the Salubo family's bottom line for this plane expedition was 8 Magi. If they lost too many Magi in the Knight's plane, the Salubo family's ranking in the Tower Forest region would be greatly affected. If the Salubo family were to transfer Magi from 2 subsidiary planes to fill in the gaps in the family's headquarters, it would be a huge blow to the stability of the 2 subsidiary planes. Therefore, Forgan, the only rank 2 Magus in the Magus camp, had no choice but to personally take action against the Radiant Knight. He planned to give these Magic Knights a ruthless blow. Tonight was a night without light. The Magi became extremely active. Other than the 10 Magi who had been roaming around the killing line, Forgan had brought another 5 Magi into the battlefield. The unlucky Radiant Knight had already been picked out, and the rest of the squads around him were naturally dealt with by other Magi. Thus, the Radiant Knight hidden in a squad naturally became Forgan's target. It was obvious that Forgan did not trust Grim and the rest. He had even brought a few of his trusted subordinates to clear the battlefield, and did not allow other Magi to get close to the battlefield. Grim, who had long since wanted to pry into the secrets of rank 2 Magi, could only use this method to gather information. Ever since he had become a rank 1 Magus, Grim had been filled with uncertainty about his future. Before he had a clear direction to move forward, before he had collected enough information, he did not dare to rashly try. This information was naturally difficult for new Magi to come into contact with. At the very least, before Grim signed an even tighter service contract with the Salubo family, he would not be able to come into contact with them. Hence, at this time, if he could gather some information about rank 2 Magi, it would undoubtedly be a beacon of hope for Grim's path as a Magus. This way, even if he did not have a way to advance, As long as he had a clear direction, Grim could rely on the AI chip's powerful calculation abilities to deduce his path forward. Violent winds howled in the blood-red night. Standing on the high cliff, the night wind that swept over from afar brought with it a hint of bloody slaughter. If Mary was here, she would definitely shout to the sky in excitement. Grim thought to himself in boredom. His eyes were fixed on a certain spot in the darkness, and a blue light flashed in his pupils. The battle had already begun. He could already smell the ice particles in the night wind, as well as a small amount of fire particles. By now, Grim could tell that the Rank 2 Wizard Forgan's innate spell was a mutated ice spell. Its attack power was so strong that it could almost completely suppress that Knight of Radiance. At the end of the day, the Knights of Light were just a bunch of magic knights, with super high magic resistance. Their greatest strength was their resistance to elemental sorcery. As for themselves, due to the lack of systematic training and meditation, they could not freely control the elemental particles in the world. Hence, they could only rely on runic energy to attack or defend. The so-called rune energy was nothing more than using some simple rune arrays to guide the mana within the mana crystals and then applying it to weapons or defensive equipment. In the wizard world, these things could not even be called magic items. At most, they could only be regarded as enchanted items. The price-to-performance ratio was way lower than magic items. However, there were specializations in every field. All the rune arrays in the night plane revolved around how to make the rune energy and the night more closely. Therefore, when it came to combining the rune energy and the source energy of life, the rune arrays here had their own unique point. Not to mention anything else, Grim was also interested in capturing a Knight of Radiance to investigate the mysteries of the rune arrays on their bodies. Once he obtained their knowledge of the rune arrays, Grim was confident that he could improve the energy system of the magic puppets. Even the Balrog transformation tattoo on Grim's body could be improved. The dark night sky was suddenly illuminated by the blue fluorescent light, and a huge ice ring that could be seen with the naked eye suddenly exploded in the mountain forest. The surrounding tall, ancient trees were instantly frozen in a sparkling and translucent world of ice crystals. The sound of ice crystals colliding with each other could be heard. Grim could not help but admire the power of a Rank 2 wizard. The night plane was a small material plane that lacked elemental energy. The same Rank 1 spell in the wizard world could have an attack effect of up to 100 degrees. However, in this plane, it could only have an attack of around 70 degrees. Moreover, the attack range and duration of the spell would be greatly reduced. Fortunately, most of the wizards that came from another plane had many magic items, scrolls, and wands to use. With the many instantaneous spells, they could still overwhelm their enemies with numbers and maintain their class advantage against knights of the same rank. The battle under the night sky lasted for half an hour before it was completely over. The result was just as expected. Wizard Forgan had a complete victory. When the victorious wizards returned to the wizard camp with their bountiful spoils of war, Grim was finally able to see the scene of the battle in person. It was on the back of a small hill surrounded by 2 or 3 boulders. There was a flat ground with a radius of only 20 meters. For a team of adventurers, this was the perfect place to camp. Unfortunately, this place had turned into a world of ice and snow. Grim walked out of the dark forest and wandered around this world of ice and snow. His eyes, which were hidden under the shadow of his hood, flashed with a pale blue light. All of his senses were activated, including his eyes, ears, nose, and mouth. He did not miss a single trace of elemental energy in the camp. The 3 meters tall boulders were covered in a thick layer of ice crystals. Even the fireplace in the middle of the camp, including the firewood and the bonfire, were frozen in a ball of ice crystals. With a light knock, a crisp sound could be heard. Its sturdiness was no less than that of normal steel. Through the translucent ice crystals, one could vaguely see the shape and color of the bonfire. The bright red flame, the scarlet red flame core that was almost white, seemed to have suddenly stopped flowing, and they were frozen at a certain moment. Fire in ice? The power of ice that could even freeze flames also contained traces of the power of laws. Otherwise, it would be impossible for two types of elements that countered each other to coexist. Next to the boulder, there were two human mercenaries lying on their side. Their faces were still filled with fear. One of their hands was holding onto the weapons on their waist, and the other was on the ground, ready to get up. Unfortunately, their lives stopped at that moment. As soon as Wizard Forgan barged into the camp, he immediately unleashed a terrifying ring of frost and got rid of everyone who was in his way. On the other side of the camp, the traces of the explosion were getting more and more obvious. Grim kept scanning the battlefield for clues, and an earth-shattering battle scene gradually emerged in his mind. Following the traces of the battle, Grim kept going deeper into the forest. Finally, he found the place where the battle ended 3 miles away. Almost half a mile of the forest had been razed to the ground. There were crisscrossing ravines everywhere. The bottom of the ravine was scorched, and there was a faint black smoke rising from it. From the many scorch marks left behind by that Knight of Radiance's powerful night battle technique, one could tell how intense the battle was. But now, these scorch marks were covered with a layer of crystal-clear frost. It showed Wizard Forgan's complete control over the entire battle. At this point, that Knight of Radiance might have been frozen in place by Wizard Forgan. It was hard for him to move, and all he could do was passively defend against Wizard Forgan's attacks. This could be seen from the angle of the attack and the location of the explosion. The Knight of Radiance's magic resistance was very high, but it still couldn't withstand the continuous attacks of spells. With Wizard Forgan's battle experience, he would never give his opponent a chance to replace the mana crystals in the rune circle. Grim stopped at the center of the battlefield. There was an ice pillar that was half a meter tall. The top half had been shattered, but the bottom half was still as hard as steel, emitting a dark blue glow. This was the place where the Knight of Radiance was defeated and captured. Grim sensed the ice pillar from a close distance. There was still Wizard Forgan's personal elemental scent, but there seemed to be something else. It's worth taking it back and studying it. Having made up his mind, Grim took out his flame scepter and summoned the fire djinn. He then used the crystal core to summon a rock python. As soon as the fire djinn appeared, it began to set everything on fire. Very quickly, everything on the battlefield was completely destroyed. The giant rock python opened its mouth and directly swallowed the ice pillar and the frozen ground. Afterward, it dove into the ground. After looking around the battlefield and making sure he didn't miss anything, Grim turned around and left. As the night breeze blew, the wantonly spreading forest fire burned all the remnants with crackling sounds. When the battlefield was completely scorched, the soil at the edge of the fire started to split open. Tens of thousands of black beetles rushed out, once again forming the shape of evil bug and tick. Damn it, that bastard has already been here. Looking at the charred land, the rising black smoke, and the unextinguished embers, Intik cursed angrily again. However, he immediately looked up at the pitch-black sky. He couldn't tell if that bastard had left any strange eyes or ears here. Chapter 203. The death of a Radiance Knight on the battlefield was no less than a super earthquake to the Demon Hunter Knight. In the past 1,000 years, there had never been a Radiant Knight dying on the battlefield. Of course, this was partly because it was difficult for the wild evildoers to reach the level of a Radiant Knight, but it was also because of their powerful combat power. Without the accumulation of knowledge and systematic inheritance, the naturally awakened evildoers had powerful talents and enviable development potential, but they could not find a place to learn systematic sorcery knowledge. Moreover, under the cruel suppression of the Demon Hunter Knights, once their identities were discovered by outsiders, they could only conceal their identities and live a precarious life of wandering from place to place. Under such circumstances, Most of the naturally awakened evildoers in the Night Continent were limited by the lack of knowledge and resources, and could only wander around the sorcerer apprentice level in pain. Even if there was a rare genius who unexpectedly advanced to become a Grade 1 spellcaster, it was difficult for them to gain an absolute advantage when facing a group of demon hunter knights. If they encountered those spellcasters, they could only die in despair. Therefore, there had never been a spellcaster who could threaten the Radiant Knights in this world. But now, with the appearance of a powerful invader, this situation was completely broken. The enraged knights were divided. Some of them requested for everyone to remain calm and continue to explore the remaining areas steadily so that they could find the lair of the invaders as soon as possible. Some of them were infuriated, thinking that the previous battle strategy was too conservative and that it was tantamount to sending their elite forces to be slaughtered by the enemy. Both sides quarreled over this, and neither side gave in. The 2 Grade 3 Dragon Knights needed to escort the injured Green Dragon back to the Dragon Cliff and were currently not at the night camp. Therefore, under the deep conflict that was difficult to resolve, the Demon Hunter Knights finally split up. The radical faction could not take it anymore. They gathered nearly 1,000 Demon Hunter Knights and rushed into the Greenland Forest without hesitation. For a time, the entire border of the Greenland Forest was filled with ferocious demonic colts with their necks raised and neighed. These terrifying beasts, which looked like a hybrid between a warhorse and a demonic wolf, carried many demon hunter knights on their backs, and galloped through the dense forest as if they were flying. Whether it was a rugged mountain stream or a high cliff or a gurgling river valley, they could pass through all of them as if they were walking on flat ground. 7 Radiant Knights led 34 Magic Breaker Knights and 828 Demon Hunter Knights to form a powerful combat team, using the Magic Colt's extraordinary climbing ability. They advanced through the forest like a tornado. Meanwhile, those terrifying wizard beasts that were constantly gushing out from the depths of the jungle also fell to the ground and turned into piles of minced meat under the knights' violent attacks. In an instant, nearly 1,000 demon hunter knights and a large number of wizard beasts started a massacre in the forest, turning the forest within a 10-mile radius into a bloody slaughterhouse. This was a terrifying battlefield in the depths of the forest. The demon hunter knights arrived at this place. In front of them was a high cliff, and on the left was a dense forest. Only on the right was the terrain a little more relaxed, and the trees were a little sparse. Thus, naturally, the vanguard of the party turned around and went to the right side of the cliff. However, just as the party of knights turned around, thousands of wizard beasts surged out, and in an instant, the party was in disarray, and it was difficult for them to take care of each other. On the cliff, in the dense forest, at the bottom of the cliff, in the forest, in the valley behind, in every area of the region, demon hunter knights and wizard beasts could be seen fighting in groups of 3 to 5. The strange sounds of swords cutting through flesh and bones, the sound of blood splattering, the angry roars of the knights, the terrifying roars of the wizard beasts, and the violent and ferocious combat skills of the knights, there was not a single quiet spot near the cliff. Burly figures wielding swords and blades were everywhere, and hideous and terrifying wizard beasts were everywhere. Grim, who was wearing a black robe, was like a terrifying Grim Reaper wandering the world in this chaotic battlefield. While he enjoyed the bloody and cruel slaughter before him, he looked for the most suitable battlefield for himself under the guidance of the Wind Breath monster. There were more than 18 sorcerers like him in the surroundings. Ever since the news of the Demon Hunter Knights coming out, the sorcerer camp finally sent 9 sorcerers over, bringing the total number of sorcerers gathered on the killing line to 19. Sorcerers rarely formed groups of 3 to 5 like the Demon Hunter Knight. Since young, the sorcerers were trained differently, so they were used to fighting without any restrictions. Moreover, they were never at ease leaving their backs to another sorcerer. That was why they always fought alone. Even though Grim and Mary had gone through many life and death situations together, they would still fight on their own if there was no need to, and rarely would they take the initiative to team up. Perhaps this was the survival instinct of the sorcerers. Grim was leisurely strolling along a river. On the other side of the river was a group of hundreds of demon hunter knights fighting an equal number of wizard beasts. At the cost of the deaths of 3 demon hunter knights, they did their best to annihilate this group of wizard beasts. When Grim passed by in his black robe, there were only a dozen or so lion and tiger beasts left on the battlefield, struggling to survive. There were 5 spellbreaker knights in this group of knights. When they saw Grim's strange black robe, they immediately roared and led more than 30 demon hunter knights towards him. There was a distance of more than 70 meters and a small river that was 5 to 6 meters wide, but it was not enough to stop their charge. Grim looked at the enemies who took the initiative to provoke him, shook his head expressionlessly, and chose to avoid them. He might be able to take down such a group, but the price he would have to pay was too high. There was another group of knights on the other side of the hill, and there were 2 knights of radiance in it. If a battle broke out here, and he could not end it quickly, it would be very easy to attract the attention of the 2 knights of radiance. To Grim, the knights of radiance were not enemies he could deal with. Therefore, Grim stretched out his right hand that was hidden under his robe, and a lava ball the size of a basin shot out from his flame scepter. He then threw it at the charging team of knights. The expression of the leading spell-breaker knight instantly changed, and he exchanged glances with his companions beside him. Both of their flame swords shot out wide flame blades at the same time, intercepting the dark red fireball that contained terrifying elemental waves above the river. Bang! A deafening explosion sounded. The violent flame wave cut the river in half, and in an instant, the boiled water droplets shot in all directions like bullets. The charging knights hurriedly put up their energy shields, and after a series of clanging sounds, they finally blocked the round of attacks unscathed. But when they put down their energy shields, and when the steam gradually dissipated, they could no longer see the figure in the black robe on the other side of the river. "It's the fire demon! It's him! Hurry up and inform everyone that the fire demon has been spotted, and tell everyone to be careful." While the few spellbreaker knights were trying their best to spread the news, Grim had already appeared in a low valley half a mile away. Here, a team of 30 or so demon hunter knights were doing their best to defend against the continuous attacks of 3 dragon knights. Fortunately, there were no spellbreaker knights, radiant knights, or dragon knights in this team. Therefore, seeing such a delicious meal, Grim no longer hesitated. The Lord of the Flames and Djinn of the Fire appeared at the same time, and they immediately rushed into the team of knights fearlessly. Since there were no strong enemies here, Grim did not transform into a fire demon. He was purely fighting in his sorcerer form. At this moment, with the terrifying strength of Grim's puppets, the Lord of the Flames and Djinn of the Fire could easily take down the group of demon hunter knights in front of him. However, considering that there were too many uncontrollable factors in the surroundings, Grim decided to end the battle quickly and joined the battle. A sorcerer puppet, a quasi-sorcerer elemental creature, and a sorcerer who specialized in fire. The 3 master pyromaniacs rushed into the battlefield and immediately plunged the area into a sea of fire and continuous explosions. Chain of fireballs, meteors raining down from the sky, and a flaming storm that engulfed almost half of the battlefield. The bombardment almost instantly put the team of demon hunter knights in a situation of life and death. The demon hunter knights at the center of the explosion did not even have the chance to fight back before they were blasted into pieces by the terrifying spells. Only the demon hunter knights at the edge of the battlefield could raise their energy shields and charge out of the sea of fire with their charred demon colt. However, what awaited them outside the battlefield was the lava fireball that Grim had casually tossed out. The elemental fireball was the size of a washbasin and covered in a layer of scorching lava, dragging a long tail of black smoke behind it. It rushed into the remaining team of demon hunters and only exploded when it collided with one of the demon hunter knights. Broken pieces of lava flew everywhere like bullets, and the terrifying lava in the core of the lava fireball splashed out, covering an area of 10 meters in an instant. Not all humans could immerse themselves in magma like Grimm without a change in expression. The boiling crimson lava was at least 2,000 degrees Celsius, and any demon hunter who was splashed by it would be instantly scalded. Their flesh, blood, bones, and even their demonic steeds would quickly melt like hot wax into a lump of unrecognizable charcoal. The demon hunter knight's magic resistance was not enough to resist the violent sorcery that had been strengthened multiple times. Chapter 204. The series of explosions naturally attracted a group of demon hunter knights. There were also many spellbreaker knights and radiant knights among them. However, when they arrived at the battlefield with their demon colts, all they saw was a bloody battlefield that had yet to be extinguished. The ground was filled with deep pits and scorch marks left by the explosion of the lava fireballs. The once boiling lava had already solidified into dark red lava. However, the remaining heat had yet to dissipate, and the battlefield was still filled with scorching heat waves. As for the small team of 30 knights, apart from a few broken limbs at the edge of the battlefield, most of them had already been devoured by the lava and flames, making it difficult to find them. As for the culprit, he had already escaped from the battlefield and disappeared without a trace. Everyone reined in their demon colts and stared at the horrifying scene that resembled doomsday with their eyes wide open. The anger and resentment in their chests burned like boiling lava, causing them to feel pain. "Pass down my order. Gather the troops and maintain a tight formation. We can't continue fighting like this. Get all the knights to gather at the center." A radiant knight with a white beard and a determined look on his face roared. Behind him, a large flag with a sword and shield was fluttering in the wind. Shortly after, the low and melodious sound of a horn began to echo in the forest. Just as Grimm turned a corner at the foot of a hill, he saw another battlefield on a gentle slope filled with green grass. A dozen or so demon hunter knights were lying on the ground in a disorderly manner in the forest. An evil short figure was strolling among them as if he was searching for something. Hearing the commotion, the short figure stood up straight and looked at Grimm with a pair of dull, lifeless eyes under the shadow of the hood. "It's a puppet. It's a fire demon." Although both parties did not have much contact with each other, they were still on the same side. Therefore, when they bumped into each other on the battlefield, they only nodded at each other and planned to pass each other by. However, at this moment, the low and melodious sound of a horn traveled along the mountain. Although the two could not understand the message conveyed by the horn, the fact that the demon hunter knights chose to blow the horn at this time meant that they were planning to shrink their formation. The enemy is preparing to shrink their formation. How about it, let's go and have a look. Grimm looked at the direction of the horn and took the initiative to invite them. Once the other party shrank their formation, although their movement speed would be much slower, the safety factor would definitely be much higher. If the wizards wanted to continue their sneak attack, the chances of encountering the Knights of Light and Spellbreaker would be much higher. At this time, it wasn't a bad thing to have a comrade by his side to restrict the number of enemies. This marionette was also a veteran magus. His elemental affinity was with the plant element, but he had strangely turned his entire body into wood. According to legend, his special ability was to use puppet threads to control other people's bodies. To be honest, it was a rather strange ability. Hearing Grimm's suggestion, the puppet pondered for a while, and finally nodded in agreement. Without another word, the two of them turned around and rushed in the direction of the sound of the horn. Although they verbally promised to become partners, Grimm never tried to approach the marionette wizard, and the marionette wizard did the same. From start to finish, both sides maintained a distance of at least 30 meters. This was actually an unwritten rule between magi. Once on the battlefield, any creature within 30 meters of a wizard would be regarded as an enemy, even if it was a comrade of the same faction. For a wizard like Mary who specialized in agility, if she came within 50 meters of any wizard, she would attract a strong reaction and hostility from the other party. It had nothing to do with hatred, It was just a way to protect oneself. After all, 30 meters was the minimum distance that most wizards could react to a crisis in time. If they got any closer, some of the weaker elemental sorcerers would be worried that they would be instantly killed by the body refinement sorcerers or some strange spells. Trust? This term did not even exist among magi. Perhaps if a wizard allowed you to get within 30 meters of him, it was already the greatest trust he had for you. If you wanted to get closer? Unless you were a slave or a weak wizard that he could completely control, it would mean an undeclared war. The two of them quickly ran in the forest. Every 5 seconds, Grim would suddenly disappear in a sudden burst of elemental flames. In the next second, he would appear in an open space in the forest about 200 meters away. The puppet wizard obviously had some special mobility abilities. Every time he advanced a certain distance, he would inexplicably crash into a tall, ancient tree. It was like a drop of water merging into a stream, without the slightest bit of delay or stiffness. Soon after, his body would emerge from the trunk of another tall, ancient tree 100 or 200 meters away. The whole process was natural and smooth, and no one could sense any elemental aura fluctuations. This was in stark contrast to his stiff and inflexible body movements, causing others to frown deeply upon seeing him. Of course, with the cautiousness of magi, they would never reveal their true situation when their companions were by their side. For example, Grim would always use flame jump in a fixed interval of 5 seconds. However, no one knew if this was the case. If someone targeted this, it was very likely that they would find something even more surprising in a life or death situation. Although both of them were silently rushing forward, they were secretly observing each other and gathering information bit by bit. This did not mean that one of them wanted to do something to the other, but it was just an instinct that wizards had developed after being cautious for a long time. If they gathered more information, they might be able to save their lives at a critical moment. Grim was obviously puzzled as to how this puppet wizard was able to complete a short-distance teleportation without anyone noticing. However, with the help of the powerful AI chip, he quickly discovered the puppet wizard's little secret. With his powerful elemental vision, Grim was surprised to find that the puppet wizard's short-distance teleportation was not completely random. In each of the tall ancient trees that appeared and disappeared, Grim could see a ball of witchcraft imprint that contained a person's aura. These sorcery imprints hidden deep inside the ancient trees were like waypoints, acting as spatial guidance, so that the puppet wizard would not lose his coordinates and direction at all. No wonder he could move through the forest so easily, without any trace of smoke or fire. It turned out that he had hidden his elemental aura in the countless ancient trees. This was not a bad train of thought and idea. Since he had seen through the puppet wizard's secret, the mysterious feeling that lingered in his heart was no longer there. Grim smiled leisurely and continued on his way. While he was silently spying on the puppet wizard was also secretly spying on his every move. Flaming Leap was a very simple fire element movement spell, but only those who understood it would be able to understand it. The advantages and disadvantages of Flaming Leap were very obvious, causing fire element magi to both love and hate it. The advantage was that it could teleport quickly. As long as there was no elemental barrier, it could freely teleport within one's field of vision, and the buffer time was very short. The disadvantage was that the teleportation was accompanied by too obvious a spell signature. Before the teleportation, one had to summon a large ball of elemental flames, and the teleporter's body would disintegrate within the flames. After the teleportation, a ring of flames would explode in the area that the teleporter had chosen, and the teleporter's body would reassemble in the flames. It was a very simple fire element spell, but the entire process was accompanied by a huge roar of flames and a dazzling ring of flames. Magi's enemies didn't even need to see, they just needed to follow the sound to easily find them. Speaking of which, it would be very difficult not to find such a large ring of flames that had suddenly exploded, Therefore, the concealment of Flaming Leap was simply too poor. Among all the short-distance teleportation spells, it was undoubtedly the most eye-catching. For a magus, being eye-catching meant being exposed, and being exposed meant being in danger. This was something that all magi tried their best to avoid. However, what the puppet wizard really couldn't understand was how Grimm could master Flaming Leap so quickly. Although Flaming Leap was a simple spell, there was a very basic requirement for it to be cast. That was the elemental transformation of the body. This was a hard requirement that could not be avoided. Without elemental transformation, it would be very difficult to disintegrate and reassemble in the elemental flames. Without the disintegration and reassembly of the body, how could Flaming Leap cross a distance of a few hundred meters in an instant? Therefore, Flaming Leap was the exclusive skill of fire element magi. But how many years had it been since Wizard Grimm advanced? According to the family's information, he had advanced less than half a year ago. How did he complete the elemental transformation of his body in such a short time? Could it be that he was already elemental converted before he became a wizard? It was precisely because he knew too much that the puppet wizard was entangled with countless questions in his mind, and it was difficult for him to find the right answer. However, every sorcerer's own ability was their most secretive wealth. Outsiders were not allowed to covet it, so the puppet sorcerer could only suppress his many questions in the bottom of his heart and quietly hurry on with his journey. Along the way, the two of them also met some other companions. Everyone simply nodded in greeting before silently joining the group. Very soon, this small team of 5 magi arrived at the target area. This was a slightly flatter and spacious valley. Although it was still filled with ancient trees and lush foliage, there weren't many shrubs and vines in the forest, so it became a temporary gathering point for the knights. Groups of demon hunter knights rushed over from all over the forest and gathered here. The noise of people and horses neighing could be heard clearly from miles away. In the middle of the forest, the flag with the sword and shield fluttering high in the air was inserted into the ground. Under the flag stood 7 especially strong and tall demon hunter knights. Around them were more than 30 knights in bright armor and majestic auras. Chapter 205. 5 sorcerers dared to challenge 7 radiant knights, 32 spellbreaker knights, and nearly 1,000 demon hunters? Of course not. However, the sorcerers still sneered in disdain at the many knights that were gathering. This was the natural disdain that spellcasters had for fighters. If this were a duel, the 5 sorcerers would not be able to defeat a radiant knight even if they joined forces. However, sorcerers were strong in their terrifying mobility and strange sorcery. As long as they had a large strategic space to maneuver, even a level 1 sorcerer would not be afraid of a group of radiant knights. Although the magic colts under the radiant knights had good survival skills and leaping and climbing abilities, they could not compare to magi in terms of speed. The radiant knights had powerful close-range combat abilities, but they could not keep the vampire-like evil sorcerers at a distance of 100 miles. If the radiant knights charged at them, the sorcerers would definitely scatter like birds and beasts, maintaining a distance as they tried to lure them into the depths of the forest. However, if they were to pursue them relentlessly, the group of demon hunters behind them would become the targets of other sorcerers' sneak attacks. It had to be said that in this primitive forest with complicated terrain and harsh environment, it was difficult for the demon hunters to fully utilize most of their advantages. On the contrary, the sorcerers, who were free and could come and go as they pleased, had the biggest home advantage. They could attack at any time, and escape at the slightest sign of danger. As for the large number of wizard beasts scattered in the forest, even if they were slaughtered by the knights, the sorcerers would not feel the pinch. Sometimes, the sorcerers would even deliberately send hundreds or thousands of wizard beasts to their deaths, just to create a chance for themselves to launch a sneak attack. Hence, when the Radiant Knights saw that there were quite a number of evil magi moving around the side of the team, they could only chase them away, not daring to pursue them too much. The Radiant Knight who died in battle last night was enough to prove that there was a powerful existence hidden among the evil sorcerers that could kill a level 2 knight. Any Radiant Knight who acted alone would no longer be as safe and worry-free as before. Looking at the demon hunters who had gathered in a row, the sorcerer's expressions did not look good. It was definitely not a problem to ambush a few demon hunters. However, once the enemy gathered into an army, the risk that they would have to bear to launch a sneak attack would be difficult to estimate. Any instructions from the camp? Wizard Felicia, who had a pair of wings of wind on her back and was wrapped in a layer of wind particles, asked in a deep voice, "You don't want us to attack an enemy team that has the protection of the Knights of Light, do you?" The sorcerers nearby and far away nodded in agreement. It was obvious that they were wary of the upcoming battle. Grim quietly looked around. He found that the wizards who agreed were the same as Felicia. They belonged to some of the more obscure professions. There were no combat wizards among them. Farrell walked the path of an arcane sorcerer, and her research direction was focused on potions. If it wasn't for the fact that she also had some wind spells, she was afraid that a sorcerer like her who didn't focus on combat would be the first to die in the plain battlefield. As for the rest, they either focused on illusions or spell formations. Like Felicia, they were not good at fighting on the battlefield. Forcing them onto the battlefield was a waste of their talents. However, the Cerubo family was currently short on manpower. If they wanted to take down the Knight's Plane in a short period of time, they would not be able to do so with just a small number of combat wizards. Therefore, with the mandatory conscription order, these arcane sorcerers who spent most of their time in witchcraft laboratories had no choice but to step onto the battlefield. For the sake of the family, for the sake of their own lives, they had to fight with all their might. Although they did not gain much in the first half-month of fighting in the forest, their very existence was a huge hindrance to the demon hunters. Therefore, combat wizards like Grim, Mary, the demonic worm, Puppet, and Thunderbird were able to find an opening and launch surprise attacks, taking the opportunity to kill many of the Spellbreaker Knight. Among the 5 wizards gathered together, Puppet was undoubtedly the closest to the Tier 2 wizard Forgan. Therefore, everyone could not help but look at him. There's no need to fight to delay until dark. The camp has a move. The lignification of Puppet's flesh had obviously affected his throat. Not only was his voice hoarse and dry, but the way he spoke was especially unbearable. However, the meaning behind his words was simple and clear, which made everyone feel slightly relieved. They were all sorcerers with many tricks up their sleeves. Now that they had a clear plan of battle, they could naturally come up with a plan. "We can't let them gather together so easily." Grim took a step forward and said coldly, "Help me hold them off for 30 seconds. I'm going to disrupt the order of their formation." Without waiting for an answer, Grim threw out a crystal core to summon the Lord of the Flames. His body then expanded, and flames erupted as he quickly transformed into a Balrog. Grim, who had transformed into a Balrog, stood side by side with the Lord of the Flames. They started chanting forceful incantations. Under their joint efforts, the clear sky was quickly covered by the gathering of fiery clouds. The fire clouds were about an acre in size, rolling and vibrating in the sky, casting a dark red hue over half of the sky. Bubbles of red lava the size of washbasins swelled in the fire clouds. As more and more fire and earth elements gathered, the fire clouds could no longer bear the weight of the bubbles. Thus, it only took 23 fingers to form a large-scale meteor shower. As the first bubble burst, a lava ball the size of a human head with fire elements in it fell towards the forest where the demon hunters were gathered, dragging a long tail of black smoke behind it. Then came the second one, the third one up in the sky. Black and red fireballs swayed and fell one after another, leaving scorch marks in the air that did not dissipate even after a long time. "Damn it, these evil sorcerers!" The Radiant Knight with white hair and beard ordered loudly, "Musel, you lead the team and leave first. Regroup as you move. Don't let the team get separated by the enemy's wizard beasts. Collier, Arns, the two of you attack with me. Let's slaughter that Magus kid who's not afraid of death." As the orders were passed down, the team of knights that were gathered in the forest finally moved out. The one leading the team was Musel, who was holding the flag of the demon hunters high up in the sky. At this moment, the first batch of fiery meteors had already reached the top of the trees. Fire, following a series of loud shouts, rune arrows were shot out one after another, exploding the falling meteors above the treetops. Even if there were some that slipped through the net, the spell-breaking knights who rushed over on horseback would swing their swords, and a terrifying flame blade slashed out, splitting the core of the fiery meteors into two. The fiery meteor exploded into a rain of fire and scorching lava. But without the powerful physical lethality, the remaining flames were not enough to threaten the safety of the demon hunters. One by one, the demon hunters raised their left hands up high, using their energy shields to block the raining flames. They patted their magic colts and quickly retreated from the area. Under the leadership of their temporary leader, Charles, two radiant knights spurred their magic colts with all their might, charging towards the fire demon that was still in the channeling stage of witchcraft. To powerful knights like them, a distance of 1.5 miles was but a matter of seconds. Seeing the three radiant knights charging towards them, the other 4 sorcerers looked at each other. Even though they were unwilling, they could only grit their teeth and stop them. Puppet was the first to act. In just a flash, his stiff body had already appeared beside the 3 radiant knights who were galloping at full speed. Without saying a word, he stretched out his hands from under his black robe, and the ends of his hands, which were covered in strange wooden patterns, pierced out countless thin threads like spider silk. With his attack power, it was pure wishful thinking to ambush the radiant knights. Hence, the target of the threads was not the radiant knights on horseback, but the magic colts they were riding. Thousands of wooden threads scattered all over the sky. Although they looked weak and fragile, once they came into contact with a human body, they could easily penetrate it, even ignoring the armor on the target's body. The leading knight, Charles, snorted angrily, and the rune sword in his hand shone brightly. Immediately after, a wide and terrifying half-moon slash shot out, the sharp tip of the blade aimed at Puppet's chest. A level 2 radiant knight attacked with all his might. The momentum and power of the attack naturally exceeded the limits of a level 1 sorcerer's personal defense. As soon as the half-moon slash left the longsword, Puppet looked down in horror and found that a faint white mark had appeared on his chest, which was covered in circles of wooden patterns. This white mark gave him a heavy sense of oppression, to the extent that it had already cut through his skin and started to penetrate his body. As for Puppet, he felt as if his soul had been locked on by the other party, and that the half-moon slash would almost certainly hit him. This was clearly an illusion, but Marionette believed it without a doubt. "Damn it!" Puppet roared in his heart. "This is the power of faith." The energy crazily surging into the wooden threads became more and more violent. Suddenly, more energy threads spread out from each of the wooden thorns, covering the sky and earth as they surged towards the 3 magic colts. Puppet himself quickly retreated, his body suddenly crashing into a tall ancient tree and disappearing in an instant. Most of the wooden thorns and energy threads that filled the sky were dispersed by the violent energy of the 3 radiant knights, but there were still a few that pierced into the magic colts. The 3 magic colts let out mournful cries, and their galloping figures suddenly slowed down. The terrifying half-moon slash spun in the air, and with a speed as fast as a clap of thunder, it chopped down the tall ancient tree that the puppet was hiding in. Then, with a burst of energy, it exploded into sawdust that filled the sky. Amidst the violent coughing sounds, the puppet staggered and fell out of another tall ancient tree 100 meters away. Countless fine cracks appeared all over its body, and with the slightest movement, wood shavings would fall to the ground. Puppet supported himself against the ancient tree and struggled to stand up. He raised his head and looked at the radiant knight with resentment. Sticky green snakes of blood slowly flowed out of his eyes, ears, mouth, and nose. His appearance could be said to be extremely tragic. With the strength of a level 1 magus, Puppet being able to escape with heavy injuries was already an extraordinary feat for a level 2 Radiant Knight. If it were any other magus, they would not even have the chance to escape. Chapter 206. Wizard Felicia soared into the sky. A few test tubes were thrown far away, smashing into the path of the Radiant Knight. A large amount of purple liquid seeped into the soil. In less than 2 seconds, the ground suddenly trembled, and a large patch of purple thorns rose from the ground. Thorny tentacles as thick as a child's arm spread out in all directions, and the thorns on them flashed with a mysterious luster that was neither gold nor wood. In the span of a few breaths, the thorny forest that had suddenly appeared had completely blocked the group of magi behind them. It was a pity that such a wall of thorns could not stop the Radiant Knights from advancing. Streaks of thick half-moon slashes shot out close to the ground, plowing a deep trench in the ground along the way. Everything in their way, be it the sturdy rocks or the thorny wall, was sliced into two by the crescent moon slash, making way for them. As for the remaining 2 wizards, before they could cast their spells, the 3 Radiant Knights had already broken through the obstacles and appeared in front of them. They could no longer attack their enemies. The 2 wizards immediately gave up on the spell they were about to cast and escaped the path of the Radiant Knight. This way, they naturally gave up on Grimm, who was still in the channeling period of his spell. Although Grimm was in the channeling period, he was still paying attention to the performance of the other wizards. The puppet wizard's performance surprised him a little, and Wizard Felicia's performance was normal. As for the last 2 wizards, it was worth thinking about. Even if they were not combat wizards, they should at least have 1 or 2 simple and practical spells, right? However, they had given up on blocking it so easily. It was obvious that they had ulterior motives and wanted to use someone else to do their dirty work. Of course, if Grimm was the main body of this meteor shower, and the Flame Lord was the support, Grimm would definitely have to bear the majority of the spell's backlash if he abruptly stopped the channeling. In a life-and-death situation like this, if he was just a little bit slower, he would be separated from his life and death. However, how could Grimm make such a mistake? Without changing his expression, he forcefully stopped the channeling of meteor shower. The only side effect was that the magic flames on the Flame Lord's body suddenly became sluggish. 2 or 3 pairs of eyes that were hidden in the shadows of the forest suddenly darkened, and they all revealed expressions of frustration and resentment. Damn it, this Grimm was really cunning. He was not the one who had triggered such a powerful spell, but the elemental puppet. This way, if he forcefully stopped the spell, most of the backlash would be borne by the elemental puppet, and the damage to his body would be negligible. Grimm did not have time to think anymore. He stabbed his hand into the Flame Lord's body and grabbed the summoning crystal core. Then, a ring of flames suddenly exploded, and he disappeared on the spot. His front foot had just flashed to his original position when the violent of the explosive slash exploded the ground. Immediately after, the 3 Radiant Knights tightly reined in their strong and agile magic colts, stopping in front of the rock and mud pillar that shot up into the sky. Although they didn't kill a single wizard, they succeeded in interrupting the evil wizard's spellcasting. Without a powerful mount, it would be extremely difficult to chase after a group of wizards with all sorts of tricks and strange methods. Even a peak rank 2 Radiant Knight like him would not be able to come out unscathed if he fell into a wizard's trap. At the very least, the powerful green dragon in Hiduran City was a good example. In all fairness, although Radiance Knights and green dragons were both Tier 2, a Tier 2 green dragon could easily defeat 3 to 5 Radiance Knights. The green dragon had a huge body. Therefore, with the same base of strength, the strength and vitality that it obtained was too overwhelming for a human knight, who was a small creature. Moreover, the green dragons could fly, breathe, and had dragon scales with astonishing defensive power. With all these advantages stacked together, They could even challenge a Tier 3 knight. Such a terrifying green dragon, under the protection of so many knights, had been beaten half of its body by a few magi who had sneaked in. It had almost lost its life in Hiduran City. As a last resort, according to the giant dragon agreement signed between the Kingdom of Knights and Dragoncliff, the two dragon knights could only escort this green dragon day and night back to Dragoncliff's location, Dragon Valley. Therefore, during this period of time, the Radiant Knights were the only ones left in the camp. Due to the lack of a strong person, many Radiant Knights could not come to a consensus. Thus, they split up. One group stayed behind, while the other went to the extremes. This led to the current situation. Should I drive them further away? The Knight of Annis could not help but ask with a solemn face. It's no use. Charles looked at the surrounding forest and shook his head. I can sense that there are still some evil magi hiding in the forest nearby. If we leave for too long, I'm worried that something will happen to the main group. Forget it, let's not bother with these annoying bugs. As long as we find their nest, I don't believe they will run away like this. The two Radiant Knights, Collier and Annis, nodded in understanding, agreeing with Charles's opinion. The three of them did not chase after Grim and the others. They turned around and patted their magic colts, chasing behind the main group and disappearing into the depths of the forest. Grim used Flame Leap and reappeared on top of a hill closest to the puppet Magus. Although they were separated by more than 70 meters, Grim did not have any intention of getting closer. Since the puppet was already heavily injured, moving closer to it would inevitably arouse suspicion and hostility. Therefore, Grim stopped far away, a gentle smile appearing on his face. Your body is not badly injured, is it? Do you need any help? The puppet turned its dull eyes and stared at Grim for a while, before shaking its head with difficulty. Shortly after, it walked in a strange manner to a tree that was as wide as 5 people's arms, and stabbed its hands into the tree trunk. As the green aura flashed, the cracks on the puppet's body healed at a speed visible to the naked eye. On the other hand, the tall ancient tree couldn't help but shiver. Countless green leaves on the originally lush canopy began to rapidly wither and turn yellow before falling to the ground with rustling sounds. In the blink of an eye, this tall, sturdy, and vigorous ancient tree had reached the end of its life. It looked like it had experienced the vicissitudes of life and was withering away. By the time the puppet pulled its hands out of the ancient tree, the wounds on its body had all disappeared, and it was full of vigor again. Of course, these were only superficial signs. As for whether this puppet Magus had suffered any internal injuries, it was not something that could be easily guessed. In a Magus group, if any member showed any signs of fatigue or weakness, it was equivalent to shouting at the other magi to fire at me. Perhaps in the next battle, this weak member would become the target of the other magi, along with the enemy. In this kind of battlefield, as long as one was careful, it was normal for a Magus to die. Hence, sometimes, magi were even more terrifying and savage after they were injured than before. The main reason was that if he did not do this, once other magi saw that he was weak, he would be in endless trouble. In the world of magi, only by being more savage and ruthless than others could you intimidate those who harbored ill intentions. Many times, the companions hiding behind were far more terrifying and deadly than the vicious enemies. An injured Magus did not need sympathy or help, but disregard. Only when everyone did not pay attention to him would he have the chance to hide in a corner and slowly lick his wound. Grim nodded at the puppet and did not say anything else. He listened to the terrifying thunder in the distance and left with a flame leap. It seemed that another Magus was launching a sneak attack on the knight. Judging from the way he attacked, it should be the combat Magus nicknamed Thunderbird. Only when Grim's flaming aura disappeared into the dense forest did the puppet Magus heave a sigh of relief. While he was confronting Grim, his right leg had been silently inserted into the soil. If Grim dared to move within 30 meters of him, the roots that broke through the soil would definitely be able to shackle him by more than 5 fingers. At that time, The puppet could choose to fight or hide according to its own will. Puppet's body trembled slightly, and the large roots that had pierced into the soil quickly retracted back into his right leg. He turned his lifeless wooden eyes and stared stiffly at a bush 100 meters away. He then turned around and entered a large tree at the side, never to be seen again. After a full quarter of an hour, when the clearing in the forest had completely quietened down, the soil in the bush that Puppet had been staring at before he left began to bulge and crack. The demonic insect in Titch slowly condensed into a body. He closed his eyes and sensed for a moment. After confirming that there were no traces of Puppet's unique and strange soul undulations in the nearby forest, a trace of resentment appeared in Titch's green eyes. A black insect shell, a sinister mouth like a lotus petal, and strange compound eyes of various sizes stacked on top of each other. Compared to the last time he had appeared, Titch's insectoid features were becoming more and more obvious. This time, there were even 2 small black feelers protruding from his insect-like head. A strange purple glow flickered faintly on top of them, as if they had some kind of special sorcery ability. Even though he knew that these veteran magi were all cunning and had strange methods, Titch, who had approached Puppet with the intention of giving it a try, was still discovered. The look that Puppet had given him before he left was obviously a warning. However, to the fearless demonic insect Titch, such a warning was not something he would take to heart. Titch spun his insect head and focused his attention on the distant battlefield that was rumbling loudly. After listening for a while, his body suddenly slumped and disintegrated into thousands of strange black insects. They once again burrowed into the ground, stealthily heading in the direction of the battlefield. When the forest quietened down once more, a pair of eyes suddenly opened on the thick trunk of an ancient tree. It blinked a few times and glanced at the wormhole left behind by the demonic insect. Immediately, a mocking smile flowed out from the pair of strange eyes before it slowly disappeared. Chapter 207. It was extremely difficult for the demon hunter knights to advance through the forest. With the speed of the demon colts, if they ran at full speed, it would not be a problem for them to travel 30 to 40 miles in an hour. But if they did that, the formation of nearly 1,000 demon hunter knights would undoubtedly become very loose. If they were to be attacked by the numerous shaman beasts that were lingering in the surroundings, then the entire group would instantly fall into disorder and become like a plate of loose sand. Moreover, the only ones who could stand on their own were the 7 Radiant Knights. While there were many demon hunter knights, they were just moving delicacies in the eyes of the sorcerers. The Spellbreaker Knights could fight against the evil sorcerers if they worked together, but if they were alone, they would attract many wolves at any moment. To keep the team compact, the Demon Hunter Knights had no choice but to slow down under the restraint of the Radiant Knights, traversing through the forest in a leisurely manner. All the creatures in the Greenland forest had disappeared, all transformed by the sorcerers into terrifying wizard beasts of various sizes. Apart from that, some of the hidden witchcraft traps in the forest also caused quite a bit of trouble for the team. The quicksand traps and gravity traps were still manageable, but the fireball traps, acid traps, and poison cloud traps were enough to kill the demon hunter knight. The terrifying sorcerers had used their evil wisdom to the extreme. The witchcraft traps were buried in the path of the knights, and there were many ways to trigger them. Some of the traps were buried underground, and when the rocks above were touched, a small fireball would fly out from the ground. It was not very powerful, but it was not a problem to burn a demon hunter knight and his demon colt into charcoal. Some of the traps were set up on branches 3 to 4 meters above the ground. Once the hanging vines were pulled, the highly corrosive acid would sprinkle down head-on. Some poison cloud traps had very strange conditions to trigger. It would only explode when a certain amount of life force was near it. Therefore, when the demon hunters riding on their demon colts slowly passed by, they would always see charred corpses on both sides of the road. Some of the corpses had their heads corroded into beehives, and some of their companions were dyed in strange colors, the dead comrades were placed by the side of the road, and after a prayer, they continued on their way. However, those who were seriously injured or poisoned couldn't be abandoned so easily. With the burden of these injuries, the knights' advance became even slower. From time to time, loud shouts from the patrolling knights could be heard from the periphery. Whenever this happened, there would always be some inexplicable and strange sorcery that would descend from the sky and land on the team. It could be a low-level lava fireball, a terrifying poisonous cloud, or a huge acid swamp. Most of the spells were destroyed by multiple rune arrows before they could even land. Even if there were some that managed to escape, they would be destroyed by the flame blades of the knights who rushed over. Although the danger they brought was not that great, it kept all the knights on edge. As they rode high up on their demonic colts and traversed through the forest, their vigilant eyes kept scanning the bushes, the treetops, and the piles of rocks. Even if they were in the middle of the group, it wasn't necessarily safe. This was because from time to time, there would be wizard beasts that were adept at concealment pouncing out from the dense canopy of trees or the messy rubble. If they were caught off guard and were scratched by their black, filthy claws, even with the physique of a demon hunter knight, it would be difficult for them to resist the biological poison that the evil sorcerers had carefully modified. An ordinary forest road that was less than 20 miles long took them 2 hours to walk, and they had lost as many as 16 non-combat members. Especially the 7 or 8 companions that were infected with the poison, they could only tie them to their demonic colts and barely follow the team. When the sun rose high in the sky and it was afternoon, a new problem arose. They were a lone army, and they had a strong belief that they would not turn back until they found the enemy's lair. That was why they rushed into the Greenland forest without hesitation. Therefore, every member of the Demon Hunter Knights only brought 3 days' worth of rations and drinking water when they set off. If it was a simple adventure, this equipment would be enough for them to search the vast forest that was nearly 200 square kilometers deep. However, after continuous cruel battles and bloody killings, they might have enough rations, but they were obviously overdrawn on drinking water. What was more frightening was that along the way, they were furious to find that almost all of the drinkable streams and springs had been occupied by the undead creatures that were emitting a pale yellow plague poison cloud. This also meant that all of the surface water sources had been seriously polluted and had become undrinkable. Humans were not machines, and it was impossible for them to maintain a high level of vigilance and combat readiness for a long time. Although the physique of the Demon Hunter Knights was several times stronger than that of ordinary people, after 5 to 6 hours of cruel fighting and arduous trekking, their physical strength inevitably fell to rock bottom. As a last resort, the higher-ups of the Demon Hunter Knights set up camp on a high hill, so that the exhausted knights could have a safe place to rest. Many of the magic-breaking knights formed groups of 3 to 5, forming patrol teams that wandered in the nearby forest to prevent the despicable sorcerers from causing trouble. As for the 7 Radiant Knights, they gathered in a small tent that was temporarily set up and discussed the follow-up plan. The lair of the evil sorcerers was located in the southern part of the vast Greenland forest that was 200 kilometers deep. After the previous bloody investigation, the Demon Hunter Knights had used their lives to sweep away nearly half of the suspicious spots. Now, in front of the 7 Radiant Knights was a vast forest that spanned nearly 100 square kilometers. The Radiant Knights who could sit here were basically fanatical radicals who abhorred evil as if they were their mortal enemies. Otherwise, they would not have been so infuriated by the fragmented investigation methods that they could not stand and rushed into the forest without hesitation. According to their previous plan, they did not have to care about the scattered sorcerers at the edge of the forest. The army would charge into the core area of the forest like a hot knife through butter. Then, they would set up camp there and spread out their men in all directions, and they would definitely be able to find the enemy's lair easily. Even if there were casualties, it would be much less than sending outstanding magic-breaking knights and teams of elite demon hunter knights to the slaughter. It had to be said that the oppressed evildoers in the Plain of Knights had deeply engraved the image of the weakness and timidity of the spellcasters into the hearts of all the Demon Hunter Knights. Even the higher-ups of the Demon Hunter Knights had never seen the invading evil sorcerers as a mortal enemy. To them, the sorcerers were a group of sinister and cunning people who were good at hiding and sneak attack. As long as they destroyed their foundation in one fell swoop, they would be like a group of rats that had their nest blown up. All they knew was to hide in a panic, and it would be difficult for them to organize any large-scale resistance. In essence, this group of radical Radiant Knights used such a simple and violent method to deal with the invading evil sorcerers. It was the most suitable and fastest method. However, they had overestimated their own strength and underestimated the sorcerers' means. If they could mobilize their army, if they could gather all the powerhouses of the plain, then the simplest and most violent method would undoubtedly be the best way. Unfortunately, the powerhouses of the plain of grade 3 and above were absent. Coupled with the internal conflicts that had led to the division of the Night Knights, these 2 points had greatly weakened the combat strength of this isolated army. Therefore, when this group of Radiant Knights gathered together to discuss their next step, the counterattack from the sorcerers' camp had already arrived. In the afternoon, the horde of terrifying magical beasts had completely surrounded the hill where the knights were resting. Then, under the command of the evil sorcerers, large groups of sorcerers broke into the cordon set up by the knights and started a cruel and bloody massacre. In the vast forest, there was a loose defense line that stretched for 2 to 3 miles. 7 Radiant Knights led a group of Spellbreaker Knights, each occupying a side, resolutely and tenaciously destroying the waves of terrifying sorcerers. On top of the high hill, there was a temporary camp for the injured. The demon hunters who were too severely injured to continue fighting were sent here to wait for treatment. Due to the lack of necessary treatment methods, the temporary demon hunters who acted as the rescue team could only use a dagger to cut off the rotten or stiff muscles, wash the wounds with a large amount of water, and bandage them. This method may be useful for ordinary skin wounds, but most of the injured knights in the camp had been attacked by the claws and teeth of the sorcerers that were infected with the virus. Before the virus was expelled from the bodies of the knights, not only would their wounds not heal, but they would also worsen and fester as time passed. This was also because the demon hunters had strong bodies. If it were an ordinary human warrior, the blood in their body would have already coagulated, and their flesh would have rotted to death. Yet, they could still fight the virus tenaciously. However, this also extended the time of their painful struggle. The sorcerer's attack lasted from the afternoon until the sky gradually darkened. After 4 hours of continuous attack, tens of thousands of sorcerers fell at the forefront of the battle, and the combat strength of the demon hunters had decreased from the initial 700 to less than 400 now. Relying on the valiant mounts and the powerful runic equipment, the demon hunters did not really lose many of their combat strength, even though their combat strength was greatly reduced. After 4 hours of continuous battle, 87 demon hunters had died in battle, but the number of knights who were attacked by the sorcerers was as high as 235. Even the knights who were still guarding the outer perimeter were all injured, but not to the extent that they could not get up. More than 10,000 sorcerers had died, and almost half of them were killed by the 7 Radiant Knights. Moreover, during the first hour of the battle, every time a series of sharp and domineering half-moon slashes plowed out a bloody path in the group of wizard beasts, the number of wizard beasts that were killed or injured had been rising. After an hour of continuous slashing and slashing, they also had to throw the Berserk Knights' combat skills into the densest areas of the sorcerers. Even the Radiant Knights could not withstand such a high-intensity battle. At the beginning of the battle, they would unleash a terrifying crescent slash every 3 to 5 minutes, but later on, they would only unleash it once every 2 to 4 minutes. In the end, their blood and chi were in turmoil, and they could not activate the powerful knight's combat skills anymore. Therefore, they could only fight like ordinary demon hunters, relying on their powerful strength and strong physique to fight the sorcerers. The number of sorcerers was not endless. In the past month, the sorcerers had hunted almost all the wild beasts and magical creatures in the forest, transforming them into sorcerers in large numbers. But in just one day, they had already lost 70 to 80% of the less than 1,000 demon hunters. Chapter 208. When night fell, the battle gradually came to a stop. The fearless and tireless wizard beasts retreated under the command of the sorcerers and hid in the forest far away. It was difficult to figure out their intentions. Looking down from the high hill, the dark forest was filled with the eyes of the wizard beasts, some green and some scarlet. Charles, with his white hair and beard, stood at the corner of the high hill with the rune longsword in his hand. He looked at the surrounding forest from afar. His heart felt like it was weighed down by 1,000-pound boulder. Even breathing was difficult. Seriously speaking, almost all of Gao Gang's demon hunter knights responded to his call to fight. Now that everyone was trapped on the high hill, they could not move and could only wait passively for the sorcerers' follow-up attack. What were the sorcerers planning by hiding in the dark? Could this group of people successfully resist the enemy's attack and wait until the enemy's strength was exhausted? His chaotic thoughts kept spinning around in his mind like a horse lantern, causing him to be lost in thought for a moment. Footsteps sounded behind him. Charles did not need to turn around to know who it was from the familiar footstep. Sure enough, Marcel's calm and loud voice sounded. "The enemy has retreated for the time being. The injured knights have just settled down." Charles's determined face became gloomy, and he said in a low voice, "How are the casualties on our side? How many knights can still fight on horseback?" After a moment of silence, Marcel's voice also became low. "There are about 386 people who can still fight on horseback. The rest, in the first chaos after entering the forest, the demon hunters lost almost 100 people to the sneak attacks of the sorcerers. In the arduous journey, another 20 to 30 knights fell on the road. After the long bloody battle in the forest, there were only 386 knights left. Didn't that mean that the knights had lost more than 300 people in the battle just now? Although most of the casualties were due to the biological toxins on the claws of the wizard beasts and lost their combat power, it was no different from dying on the battlefield when surrounded by enemies. It was even to the extent that on many occasions, these fellows who were heavily injured and on the verge of death would rather die under the claws of shaman beasts. After all, the demon hunter knights had always been known for their fierce attacks and swift movement on the battlefield. Now that they were dragging more than 300 injured people on their backs, how could they break through the enemy's encirclement? The rest of the Radiant Knights also gathered around, waiting for their leader Charles's orders with resolute eyes. The muscles in Charles's face began to tremble slightly. It was so easy to give an order. But behind every order was a mountain of bloody corpses of demon hunter knights. As the leader of the knights, he knew very well what kind of order could save the lives of the remaining demon hunters. But when the words reached his mouth, his grizzled beard trembled, and he still couldn't say them. Abandoning his companions. Abandoning their comrades. Since when did the knight's maxim, which the demon hunter knights had always followed, become a number that could be added and subtracted on paper? Seeing the difficult and painful choice of the leader, the more pragmatic Muscle said calmly, "It's impossible for everyone to break out. We can't abandon the wounded here. So, Charles, take some people and break out. I'll stay with them and continue to defend. You take some people back to the camp and ask for help. Winsole and the others won't leave us in the lurch." When he said the word, "ask for help," Muscle's words also became difficult. As a proud Radiant Knight, making Charles bow to the stubborn and conservative Winsole was undoubtedly another and more difficult battle. However, the current situation forced him to say it. The muscles on Charles's face twitched even more violently. Finally, the leader of the radicals made up his mind and said resolutely, No, Muscle, I shouldn't be the one to go back. I should bear the greatest responsibility for today's reckless advance, so I have to stay and stabilize the morale of the army. You, Collier, Arns, Jose, the four of you will lead 200 people back to ask for help. You can tell Winslow that as long as he's willing to help, I'm willing to hand over all my authority. The scene suddenly fell into a dead silence. Every radical's face revealed a pained and struggling expression. With Charles's order, it meant that from now on, the radicals would forever be inferior to the conservative knight. For the proud and arrogant knights, this was something more painful than death. However, just as everyone's emotions were in turmoil, an extremely terrified scream suddenly came from a corner of the high hill. Soon after, like a storm sweeping over, the entire camp was filled with cries of pain. "What are you guys panicking about?" Muscle drew out the brilliant rune longsword and shouted, "Stay calm, the enemy hasn't." Before he could finish speaking, his expression suddenly changed. Unknowingly, an unpleasant stench of decay had entered the camp along with the night fog that filled the forest. It was like a shepherd boy blowing a bewitching piccolo. When the stench spread throughout the camp, the wounded who were lying on the high hills and dying suddenly experienced a terrifying change. The knights could clearly see that in the open space closest to them, an injured person with a weak breath suddenly began to convulse violently. His originally pale face suddenly flushed red, and he gritted his teeth so hard that they creaked. Milky white foam continuously gushed out from his mouth and nose. His eyes were wide open, and because he used too much force, even the corners of his eyes were broken. Purplish-black blood gushed out from his eyes, ears, mouth, and nose. His body began to twist and contort into various unimaginable forms. After spitting out the blood, he began to scratch his body with all his might. He used so much force that the skin on his face and body were all bloody and mangled. A demon hunter knight in charge of taking care of him wanted to stop him, but no matter how hard he tried, he could not stop him from harming himself. Instead, he was bitten on the arm. All the Radiant Knights possessed extremely strong physiques, but at this moment they could vaguely feel a trace of discomfort. They looked around in panic and finally found the culprit that caused the chaos in the camp. Fog. No, to be more specific, it should be some kind of mysterious substance that had blended into the fog. The injured knights in the camp were undoubtedly the weakest in terms of physique and spirit. Hence, some of the mysterious black particles in the fog could be seen swimming into their wounds like fish. As far as the eye could see, the injured on the high hill were all surrounded by thick black smoke. Amidst the black smoke, the injured knights struggled in pain, tearing their armors and inner linings, and even scratching their own flesh until it was dripping with blood. It looked like they were about to tear their own skin off. As the black smoke blended in, the appearance of these injured suddenly changed drastically. The skin on the surface of their bodies began to melt, and the bright red muscles and tendons were directly exposed to the air, causing everyone to become bright red. But gradually, the color of blood began to fade, and a sticky and disgusting liquid began to fill the surface of their bodies, causing them to become wet again. The thick muscles and tendons gathered together, and the insufficient stretching caused their bodies to become thin and hunched. However, the strength of their bones and muscles was clearly much stronger than before. They were roaring angrily. At first, they were like mournful wails of humans, but later on, they became more like wild beasts, and only strange hee-hee sounds were left. Sharp fangs, sharp claws, and spines on their backs began to grow rapidly. When their claws subconsciously scratched a piece of rock, there was a crisp sound, and dazzling sparks exploded. Right in front of the Radiant Knights, on this high hill, a wounded knight who was on the verge of death actually completed his undead transformation. He was forcefully transformed by a powerful evil force into an undead creature that had never appeared in the night plane before, a ghoul. After completing the undead transformation, this ghoul turned over and crawled on the ground. Its eyelids suddenly flipped, revealing milky white and turbid eyeballs. It was so white that no pupils could be seen. Although it did not have pupils, this did not hinder the ghoul's vision. Its special life perception made it especially sensitive to the aura of life. It opened its mouth, revealing its sharp fangs, and let out a low and threatening roar at the radiant knights. Its body bent slightly, and its strong hind legs stomped on the ground with great force. This ghoul pounced at the demon hunter knight closest to it like a sharp arrow. The demon hunter knight was clearly stunned by the scene in front of him. He retreated in fear, but could not think of drawing his sword to fight back. This was a comrade that he was once familiar with. As a radiant knight, Marcel had undoubtedly experienced far more terrifying and strange things in his life than the young demon hunter knight. He quickly broke free from his shock and fear and rushed forward. He held the sharp sword in his hand horizontally and slapped the body of the leaping ghoul with the flat of the sword. "Get down!" As he roared, the ghoul was sent flying, and it crashed into a small tree that was as thick as a human's waist 10 meters away. The sound of bones cracking could also be heard from the ghoul's body. But this blow clearly did not make the ghoul lose its ability to fight. The ghoul rolled on the ground a few times, and when it got up again, most of the bones on the front of its body were already broken. But it actually struggled to get up without a care, dragging its twisted and slanted body towards Marcel again. Die! Marcel finally recognized reality, and no longer held back. The sword in his hand flashed, and like a sharp knife cutting through paper, it silently cut the ghoul in half. But when the sword cut through the ghoul's spine, he felt a slight obstruction in his hand, and his expression changed slightly. He was a grade 2 radiant knight. If even he felt a slight obstruction when slashing this monster, what would happen to the other demon hunter knights when they encountered monsters? Chapter 209. The Knight's Plane had never seen such evil undead creatures as ghouls. In some of the more remote areas there might be some wild undead creatures, but most of them were low-level skeletons that squeaked as they walked, or some withered corpses that crawled out of the ground. There were even some spirits that had lost their intelligence. As for elite undead creatures like the ghouls, they would not appear naturally without the help of an undead controller. But today, under the influence of the wizard beast plague and the catalysis of the black smoke, the injured demon hunter knights could no longer withstand the powerful witchcraft and were transformed into strong and healthy ghouls. Perhaps it was because the knights' original physique was too strong that the ghouls they transformed into possessed extraordinary strength and physique. Of course, the ghouls' unique agility was also enhanced. They were like a group of skinned humans that were soaked in stinky water for a few days and nights. Their bodies were pale as if they had drowned. Their skin was sticky and slippery, emitting a pungent stench. Under the terrified gazes of the demon hunter knights, the ghouls that had completed their transformation gathered together and launched an attack on the humans around them. The demon hunter knights were caught off guard, and just as they drew their swords, they were knocked to the ground by the pouncing ghouls. Their sharp claws and powerful physique made their attacks exceptionally sharp. The knight's armor that was as thick as a finger was as thin as a piece of paper, easily torn and pierced through by the ghouls. The ghouls crawled on the demon hunter knights, opened their mouths and bit down on their necks. With just one bite, half of the demon hunter knight's neck was destroyed. His neck was bleeding profusely, his throat was broken, and blood gushed out like a fountain. The demon hunter knights that were attacked immediately lost their ability to fight back. They could only press on the wound on their necks with their hands. Even their last cry for help was swallowed by the blood that flowed out of their mouths and noses. Of course, there were some knights who reacted quickly and drew their runed swords to fight the ghouls that were charging at them. However, the excess fat and useless organs in the ghouls' bodies had all melted away. Under the nourishment of their flesh and blood, their bones had become especially thick and sturdy. Their muscle fibers and tendons had also become as strong as steel wire. As a result, Every slash of the demon hunters felt as if they were hacking a particularly tough ancient tree. They were shocked by the difficulty that came from the bottom of their hands. Left with no choice, all the demon hunter knights could only activate the rune arrays on the rune sword. As the bright red and blue runes flowed on the long swords, the knights had a much easier time fighting the ghouls. No matter how tough the skull and body of a ghoul was, it could not compare to the sharpness of a rune weapon. Soon, the demon hunters regained the upper hand and began to force the ghouls to a corner of the campsite. However, in the 15 minutes of chaos, another 40 demon hunter knights had fallen victim to the sharp claws of the ghouls. Every demon hunter knight who witnessed the scene was filled with a towering rage as his flesh was torn apart and his body was bitten until there was not a single unscathed part of his body. These evil magi! They should be torn to shreds. The Knight of Marcel strode forward and swung his berserk flame blade horizontally like an indestructible red machete. It flew for more than 50 meters and finally broke a tree that was so thick that it would take 2 people to wrap their arms around it before it completely disappeared. As it flew through the air, the pale and swollen bodies of 7 ghouls were silently cut in half. Black, sticky blood soaked the ground beneath their feet. Don't get entangled with them. Get on the magic colts, we. Marcel's powerful voice came to an abrupt halt, replaced by shock and unconcealable fear. At a corner of the campsite where they stored their magic colts, black smoke had already enveloped the area. Under the influence of the terrifying witchcraft, the demonic colts howled and fell to the ground one after another. Blood was gushing out of every pore on their bodies. Purplish-black blood. For a long time, the demon colts that had accompanied the demon hunter knights day and night were about to die. For a moment, even a knight of radiance like Marcel could not help but feel the world spin. Everything in front of him became so blurry. They were knights. Knights who had lived their entire lives on horseback and rode their magic colts on the battlefield. Exquisite and sturdy knight armor, exquisite arm shields that could eject energy shields, iron gloves that balanced flexibility and defense, iron knee pads, metal boots, as well as rune longswords and rune bows made of special metals. Excluding the small accessories, the rune equipment alone weighed 45 kilograms. With such heavy equipment and the weight of the knights, only the sturdy magic colts could carry them. If they were ordinary warhorses, they would probably be half dead from running 2 laps around the campsite, not to mention climbing mountains and ridges. Hence, when the Radiant Knights saw the demonic colts being killed by the evil sorcerer, their vision turned black and they almost fainted. However, at this moment, mournful howls came from the forest near the campsite. The damned wizard beasts had started attacking again. At some point in time, the stars in the night sky above the high hill were replaced by rolling red cloud. Hundreds of bubbles of various sizes floated and churned inside. Every time one of them burst, a dazzling red glow and scorching flames would spill out. The red clouds churned endlessly, and a large meteor shower was about to take shape in the blink of an eye. The leader of the knights, Charles, staggered 2 steps and spat out a mouthful of blood in front of him. A few of his companions tried to help him up, but he pushed them away with great force. Charles pulled out his longsword with all his might, and a dazzling flame rose instantly. Go quickly. Don't care about the wounded and the magic colts in the campsite. Quick, everyone gather and break out in one direction. Charles's white beard was already dyed red by the blood. He waved his sword and ordered at the top of his lungs. After giving the order, Charles's blood boiled, and a domineering and violent force began to gather crazily. When the force was at its peak, Charles let out a soft whistle that shook the forest, and the flaming longsword in his hand slashed out. A red arc of the sword pierced through the sky and went straight into the roaring and churning red clouds. In the next second, the meteor shower, which was ready to be launched, went out of control. The internal structure of the extremely condensed and violent fire elements was destroyed by the red arc of the sword, and Grimm instantly lost control of the fiery clouds. In the sky, an enormous doomsday volcano erupted, forming a huge pillar of fire that looked like a mushroom cloud. It then turned into a sea of fire and fell into the forest under their feet. In a hidden valley 2 miles away, Grim was lying in a huge spell formation, vomiting blood. The Lord of the Flames, who was standing beside him, also let out popping sounds of explosion, as if it had suffered a serious backfire from a spell. The usually bright red protective flames on his body were now dim, and there were even some parts of his body that had been completely extinguished, revealing his ugly, uneven body of lava. After a quarter of an hour, Grim finally broke free from the serious backfire of the spell. He took out large and small bottles of potions, powders, and potions, and swallowed 4 or 5 of them in one go before letting out a long sigh of relief. Damn it, in order to avoid being attacked by the enemy's night battle technique, he had deliberately guided the fiery clouds to an altitude of 200 meters when he activated the meteor shower. Who knew that he would not be able to dodge the terrifying attack of the radiant night? Damn it, damn it, damn it! If the night battle technique had such a long range and such terrifying power, how could Magi fight against knights? Perhaps the Magi would be hacked to death by the swords of the knights while they were still painstakingly chanting spells. Apart from a few simple spells that could be cast in an instant, most spells that were powerful or had a large area of effect required the chanting of spells and the assistance of hand gestures. On the other hand, the night battle technique required the sword to be brandished, and the power gathered was terrifying. Grim knew that the one who had broken his spell was a radiant knight. It was normal for a grade 2 knight to deal with a grade 1 magus like him. However, things had been going smoothly for him during this period of time, and Grim had become a little impatient. Otherwise, with his forbearance and dormant personality, he wouldn't be the first fool to make the first move. Perhaps at this very moment, there were many Magi in the surrounding forests waiting to see him make a fool of himself. Grim did a simple recuperation and kept the Flame Lord, which had lost a lot of energy. He summoned the hunter demon crocodile and sank into the ground with it. A moment later, a towering pillar of fire ignited within the spell formation, wiping away all traces of his presence. There were too many Magi wandering around, and Grim did not dare to let any of his body parts fall into the enemy's hands. This was especially true for blood. Grim himself had grasped a dozen or so spells that used his blood, hair, and skin to cast long-range curses on his enemies. If he were to encounter a terrifying magus who specialized in curses, it was said that even the air exhaled by the enemy could be used to gather information. If they were to get their hands on the hair or blood that had fallen off your body, they could perform a large-scale cursing ritual and kill all those who were related to your bloodline. No matter where they were, they would not be able to escape from such a terrifying bloodline curse. Hence, living among the Magi, it was best to be cautious and stay in seclusion. Do not offend any magus without good reason. If you really had no choice but to form a blood feud with a magus, remember to kill the other party at the first opportunity. It would be worth it even if you had to pay a huge price. Chapter 210. In the dark of the night, countless panicked figures were running in the forest. The demon hunter knights who once dominated this plain were now frightened by the mere twang of a bowstring. They took off their heavy armors, threw away their iron greaves, threw away their helmets. Some of the knights even abandoned their rune bows, leaving only a rune sword and the exquisite arm shield that never left them. They were like stray dogs, running quickly in the thick fog of the night. From time to time, someone would trip on the roots of a tree, or fall off a cliff that was 4 to 5 meters high. 3 radiant knights led the charge, while 4 radiant knights led a group of spellbreaker knights at the back. The group of people fought and retreated at the same time. They killed a bloody path in the forest and broke out of the encirclement of Gao Gang. At first, all the demon hunter knights could still follow the dazzling flaming sword, but as the howls from the surrounding forest grew denser and closer, everyone's mind was in a mess. Some of the knights were already exhausted, some were covered in wounds, but most of them were gritting their teeth and holding on. They supported each other, encouraging each other, and ran with the crowd with all their might. Of course, there were also some demon hunter knights who had lost their courage and chose to leave the group, disappearing into the dark forest in groups of 2s and 3s. In such a cruel battlefield, most of the sorcerer's attention was attracted by the large group of knights. As long as they could break through the defense line of the wizard beasts, there was a high chance that the scattered demon hunter knights could escape. To be honest, there was a certain logic to this idea. But in a situation where their armor was incomplete, and they did not have a magic colt to ride on, and their combat power was greatly reduced, could a small number of demon hunter knights withstand the hordes of wizard beasts and ghouls? This was no doubt a difficult puzzle to solve. In the darkness, there was finally a sorcerer who could not help but make a move. A dark green ball of light the size of a human head shot out from the shadows and landed in the middle of a group of demon hunter knights who were running in panic. The ball of light exploded and countless glowing acid arrows rained down in all directions. 3 of the knights who were closest to the ball of light did not even have time to put up their energy shields, and were riddled with holes by the acid arrows. The heavy body fell to the ground, making a strange sound that made one's teeth ache and legs go weak. In less than 7 seconds, the 3 demon hunter knights were dead, and even their bodies had completely melted into a pool of green liquid. Most of the knights in the outer circle were able to raise their energy shields in time to block the acid arrows. Only one of them was not fast enough, and an acid arrow pierced through his thigh. The injured demon hunter knight dropped his rune longsword and rolled on the ground in pain. The sizzling sound of his flesh being corroded was unbearable. A familiar companion stopped and took out a dagger to protect him. He tore open his trousers and planned to help him cut off the blood and flesh. However, what he saw was a huge wound that had melted into a bloody pulp. His entire right leg had turned green, and the terrifying green color was rapidly spreading upwards. "Can you bear with it? I can't keep this leg." His companion screamed and threw away his dagger. He drew his sword and raised it high, intending to save his life in exchange for his broken leg. However, at this moment, a strange panting and running sound could be heard. A large group of wizard beasts and a few ghouls swarmed over like a swarm of bees. The 2 panicked people did not even have time to struggle or resist. Their bodies were swallowed by the terrifying figures that came like a tidal wave. In the depths of the forest, a middle-aged sorcerer wearing green leather armor was laughing excitedly. A green ball of light floated in front of his chest. From time to time, a strange green shadow would shoot out from the ball and into the ranks of knights in the distance. Every time, he would successfully kill 2 to 3 demon hunter knights. However, just as he was about to lose control of his excitement, his expression suddenly changed. He fell to the ground and rolled to the side. Almost at the same time, a red flame blade pierced through the air from the darkness. In one breath, it cut through 11 ancient trees before slowly dissipating. The green-armored sorcerer's expression instantly became extremely ugly. If he did not dodge in time, that flame blade would have definitely cut him in half from the waist down. Against such a powerful knight combat technique, even if he cast all of his defensive spells on himself, it would still be useless. The difference in strength was too great. Even an old dog that fell into the water dares to turn around and bite back. Cursing in a low voice, the green-armored sorcerer patted the human bones necklace on his chest. His entire body suddenly became hazy and illusory, and he quickly disappeared from where he stood. However, before he could quickly escape into the darkness of the forest, a dazzling flaming longsword flew over with an ear-piercing whistle. With a thud, it nailed him to the ancient tree behind him. The green-armored sorcerer raised his neck and let out a painful howl. Although a flaming rune sword had pierced through his chest, he did not die. Instead, he quickly grabbed a long green staff out of thin air and planned to escape for the second time. Unfortunately, The energy flames on the rune's sword burned his body into ashes in an instant. All that was left was a hideous head and a long green staff that fell to the ground. Charles took firm steps out of the darkness and came to the front of the tree. He pulled out his long sword and picked up the remaining head of the sorcerer. He raised it high and shouted at the distant forest, "Come, come! This is your only fate." In an instant, the forest became much quieter. Countless gazes pierced through the layers of foliage and trees, silently scrutinizing the terrifying head held high by the radiant knight. Just an idiot! Countless people sneered coldly, but in their hearts they were already on high alert. From the start of the battle until now, the ones who had tormented this 1,000-strong army of demon hunter knights were a bunch of Grade 1 sorcerers. Even if the other party had radiant knights that could absolutely crush them, and there were even 7 of them, the sorcerers did not feel the slightest bit of fear. There were even some ambitious sorcerers who were scheming on how to capture a radiant knight. However, at this moment, when they saw the fate of that rash idiot, they could not help but warn themselves again. A Grade 2 knight was indeed a Grade 2 knight. Even if they were in dire straits, they were still a terrifying powerhouse that could kill them at any time. These sorcerers could act as sinister and cunning wolves in front of the sheep-like demon hunter knights or even the magic breaker knight. However, when faced with the ferocious radiant knights, they could only suffer in silence. The weakness of a Grade 2 knight was only relative to a Grade 2 sorcerer. To a group of Grade 1 sorcerers like them, the other party still had the ability to completely crush them. Understanding this, even if it made them feel a little humiliated, they could still save their lives at the crucial moment. Countless sorcerers looked at this scene in humiliation, their hearts filled with hatred as they gritted their teeth. However, sorcerers who had always advocated using their brains and knowledge to defeat their enemies would not rush forward recklessly. Hence, a few of the stronger Grade 1 sorcerers could not help but use their brains. In the dark forest, Grim perched on the back of a demon crocodile hunter, chasing after the team of demon hunter knights at lightning speed. In front of him and behind him, countless earth puppets and wind breath monsters formed a tight blockade, allowing him to keep track of every movement within a 5-mile radius. However, just as he was rushing forward, a wind breath monster at the periphery suddenly transmitted a strange scene to him. Grim thought for a moment and stopped the demon crocodile hunter's advance. He took out his flame scepter and waited silently. Soon, with a crisp crackling sound, a man wrapped in thousands of arcs of lightning appeared in the sky. Blue armor, a striking bald head, and dense runes were etched on his skull. From his appearance, he should be a middle-aged man in his 40s. Grim recognized him. He was a sorcerer from the sorcerer camp who was good at controlling lightning, nicknamed Thunderbird. To be honest, although they were in the same sorcerer camp, they usually wore thick robes or cloaks, and their faces were also covered with spells. Hence, this was the first time Grim had seen the true face of this sorcerer Thunderbird. "You must be Grim, right?" Thunderbird asked coldly. "Go to the Spider Valley 10 miles away for a meeting. Boss Hyde has invited you to deal with the Radiant Knight together. I've already conveyed the message. It's up to you whether you want to go or not." After saying this, Thunderbird did not stay any longer. With a flash of lightning, he disappeared. Looking up at the lightning scorch marks in the night sky, Grim was slightly surprised. Meeting? But then he seemed to understand something and coldly said, "Humph, finally someone can't stand the arrogance of a Grade 2 knight. Meeting? Looks like he's going to arrange something. Let's go and take a look." Immediately after, the demon crocodile hunter turned around and ran towards the Spider Valley in the distance. Spider Valley. As the name suggested, Spider Valley was a terrifying place where spiders abounded. As soon as one entered the valley, the gloomy forest was filled with dense white spider webs and terrifying spiders crawling between the branches. But strangely, although there were many kinds of spiders, the largest one was only the size of a fist. There was no sign of the calf-sized hunter spiders and ghost-faced spiders in the past. Of course, Grim knew this very well. This was because he had personally swept through the Spider Valley, and all the large spiders that had any value had been sent back to the sorcerer camp. So the current Spider Valley was somewhat unworthy of its name. The meeting place was not far from the entrance of the valley. When Grim arrived, there were already 4 people waiting silently: Puppet, Evil Bug, Phantom, and Boss Hyde. Of course, Grim already knew Puppet and Evil Bug, so he focused most of his attention on the latter two. Chapter 2:11. Although Phantom looked like an enchanting beauty with a sexy body, considering her expertise in illusions, Grim's brain automatically ignored her beauty when he looked at her. Who knew if there was a fat and plump body hidden under her hot and sexy body? Of course, Grim could also use his elemental vision to see through the other party's appearance. However, when facing an opponent of the same rank as him, such invasive probing was undoubtedly an offense, and it was very likely to cause the other party to retaliate. Therefore, when there were other magi around, Grim would purposely turn off his probing ability, only allowing the AI chip to collect information passively. In addition, one of the main reasons why Grim defined her as a female magus and not a witch was that in the magus world, a witch was a special term used to refer to female magi with ancient inheritances. Therefore, the witch was definitely a female magus, but a female magus was not necessarily a witch. The phantom magus in front of him walked the path of an orthodox elemental magus, and had nothing to do with the group of witches in the north of the magus continent. There were many magi who had an affinity with illusions, but most of them belonged to the auxiliary type, and not many were suitable for the bloody battlefield. After all, magi nowadays would be embarrassed to go out without an illusionary dispelling wand or a concentration necklace. Therefore, with the widespread use of these auxiliary tools, the battle power of magi who specialized in illusions would inevitably be greatly reduced. However, the fact that this phantom magus could be invited today showed that she had her own unique ability in the field of illusions. Otherwise, it would be impossible for her to join this combat team. After a simple look at the phantom magus, Grim shifted most of his attention to Hyde. Hyde was obviously walking the path of an arcane magus. He was more than 2 meters tall and burly, but there were obvious traces of mechanical modification on his body. His left forearm had been chopped off at the elbow and replaced with a bronze-colored mechanical arm. There was no skin covering on the surface, and outsiders could even see the metal chains, gears, shafts, and many other indescribable mechanical parts inside. At a glance, this magus Hyde's body had been modified countless times. Mechanical arms, mechanical lower limbs, metal eyes, and many strange mechanical equipment attached to the surface of the body. If Grim were to describe him, Wizard Hyde was simply a sophisticated machine. It was just that the surface of the machine had some human flesh attached to it, a robot. Grim was very curious. If he opened the chest of this sea wizard, would he see warm flesh and blood, or countless crazy gears and connecting rods? For these guys who had gone through cruel body modifications, their strength lay in their energy output far exceeding that of ordinary wizards and their dazzling strange abilities. One had to know that most magi's bodies were still very fragile. When they were not using witchcraft, they were just a bunch of weak fellows who had to lean on the wall to catch their breath before climbing a few floors. However, once the witchcraft was completed, they would immediately transform into omnipotent gods that could control heaven and earth. Mechanical sorcerers, on the other hand, could use magical machines with magical powers to replace the fragile body organs. In this way, even if they didn't use witchcraft, their bodies would have some natural witchcraft effects, and it would be eternal. Therefore, the mechanical magi paid the price of a human's appearance and enjoyment, but in exchange, they were abnormally strong and strange. It was said that a large number of arcane sorcerers had gathered in the Sky City on the west coast of the Wizard Continent, and most of them were mechanical sorcerers. The Sky City, which was a wizard city floating 10,000 meters above the ground, represented the highest achievement of magical machines. Although Grimm wanted to know more about this wizard hide, there was a slight mechanical buzzing sound, and a strange wave appeared around Hyde's body, preventing him from probing further. Grimm smiled awkwardly and nodded to Hyde and the puppet. He then walked to the side and closed his eyes to wait. He did not keep them waiting for long. After a while, thunder roared in the sky and lightning flashed. The Thunderbird wizard had also rushed back. Behind him were Bloody Mary and another mysterious magus hidden in a black robe. Seeing that all the people he invited had arrived, Wizard Hyde cleared his throat and began to introduce with a strange metallic voice, "Everyone, the reason why I called you all here today is because of that hateful Radiant Knight. If we let them break out of the encirclement safely, then the price we've paid before will be in vain." Faced with such an old-fashioned opening, all the wizards chose to remain silent. Although the battle was disadvantageous, it was very likely that the family's expansion of the plane would fail. Once everyone was expelled from the plane by the local natives, the resources and rewards promised by the family would be gone. However, if the wizards here were forced into the battlefield as cannon fodder, they would only work and not put in any effort. They would prioritize their own lives first. Therefore, Wizard Hyde, who was familiar with the nature of wizards, immediately changed the topic. "I'm going to launch a sneak attack on that Radiant Knight. If everyone here is willing to participate, then stay behind and continue the discussion. If anyone is not willing to participate, you can leave now. The only thing I can guarantee is that once the plan succeeds, everyone will be able to get the things they want the most." Finally, there was a slight change in the expressions on the wizards' faces. As wizards, they adhered to the principle of fair exchange of benefit. If there was no benefit, or if it was too dangerous, they would instinctively choose to avoid it. Launching a sneak attack on a Rank 2 knight was definitely a dangerous mission that exceeded their capabilities. However, if they could get the resources and knowledge they wanted the most, taking some risks seemed to be acceptable. Everyone's eyes flashed slightly, as if they were silently calculating something. Wizard Hyde looked around with his mechanical eyes and waited for a moment. Seeing that no one left, he finally relaxed a little. Everyone here was a powerful wizard that he had carefully selected. Every one of them had a strange witchcraft ability that others would not be able to achieve. Therefore, if any of them left, it would have a big or small impact on his plan. If necessary, he would have to lower the threshold of his selection and find a replacement from the remaining wizards. Since no one left voluntarily, that means everyone is willing to participate in this plan. Alright, then let's discuss each other's requirements. No wizard was willing to make such a private matter public, so what followed next was a one-on-one discussion between Wizard Hyde and each participant. Hyde's lips moved slightly, but no sound could be heard. It was obvious that he was secretly talking to a wizard. After waiting for about a quarter of an hour, Grimm finally heard a prompt from the AI chip in his mind. A special spiritual force channel has been detected. Initiator, Wizard Hyde. Requesting host's instructions to connect? Connect. In the next second, Wizard Hyde's peculiar metallic voice sounded in Grimm's mind. "Hello, Wizard Grimm. Time is of the essence, so let's get straight to the point. If I invite you to participate in this dangerous hunt, what do you want?" Grimm hesitated for a moment, then slowly said, "I want to obtain the part of the knowledge about the fusion of rune energy and life energy." This request is a little difficult. After all, the complete knowledge about the fusion of energy could only be grasped by the huge force behind them. Even if we killed them and obtained some incomplete knowledge about the runes, it would still be extremely difficult for us to deduce the next part of the fusion of energy. If I'm not wrong, Lord Forgan captured a Radiant Knight alive last time. I'm sure we can get a lot of their internal secrets from his brain. Wizard Hyde, who was far away, twitched his body in astonishment. His red mechanical eyes carefully sized up Grim again. I have no right to divulge any information about the camp. If I can't directly obtain the knowledge about the fusion of energy, I would also like to know how to obtain it. In other words, I want to know who else in the Knight's continent has the complete knowledge about the fusion of energy. Of course, it'd be best if it's someone I can deal with. You really are a far-sighted magus. If I'm not wrong, other than the rare resources in this plane, the most valuable thing is the knowledge about runes. The knowledge about the fusion of energy that you asked for, Lord Cerubo has already defined it as a rank 3 strategic resource. It will never appear in your hands. As for the mortals who have this knowledge, although they are not under our control, you will still need to hunt for them yourself. I can only provide a list of the corresponding members. That's enough. I accept this condition. In the next second, a contract formed from the power of the will appeared in Grim's mind. The AI chip dutifully scanned the contract in detail. After eliminating the language logic, magic patterns, and loopholes in the contract, it sent the detailed contract to Grim. Grim gave it a quick glance. It was exactly the same as what he had just discussed. Only then did he carefully leave his spell imprint on the contract. After another half an hour, Wizard Hyde signed the contract with the rest of the wizards. With the restriction of the contract, everyone's attitude became a lot friendlier. In order to make it easier for them to coordinate with each other, Wizard Hyde let everyone briefly introduce their own witchcraft abilities. To encourage everyone to speak, Wizard Hyde was the first to speak. Hyde, mechanical wizard. Expert in close combat in a small area. His spells include energy light blades and sharp awls. The second one to speak was Razor. Thunderbird, elemental wizard. Expert in lightning spells. Currently, he has mastered Cloud Storm, lightning bombardment, and lightning teleportation. Marionette, bloodline wizard. Expert in transforming plant. Currently, he has mastered puppet thread and wood substitute. Demonic worm, bloodline wizard. Expert in transforming insect. Currently, he has mastered insect repelling, split attack, and damage sharing. Phantom, elemental wizard. Expert in illusion spells. Currently, he has mastered dream environment and dream dissociation. Fire demon, elemental wizard. Expert in fire spells. Currently, he has mastered Flame Demon Transformation and Flame Boundary. Blood Lady, bloodline wizard. Expert in blood spells. Currently, he has mastered Bat Demon Transformation and Blood Sucking Attack. Evil Shadow, elemental wizard. Expert in curse spells. Of course, no one would reveal their trump cards in a situation like this. Therefore, the introductions were very vague. However, since Wizard Hyde had gathered everyone together, he must have more or less understood everyone's situation. Chapter 212. The massacre in the forest continued. However, the battlefield had shifted from Gaogang to 30 miles away. This was a road of death paved with the corpses of wizard beasts. It left an indelible mark in the hearts of every demon hunter knight. At this point in the battle, both sides were having a hard time holding on. On the human side, there were less than 200 demon hunter knights who could make it from Gaogang to here, and all of them were injured. The pressure on their minds and bodies had reached their limits, and they were on the verge of collapse. On the other hand, the sorcerers had lost nearly 30,000 wizard beasts since the beginning of the battle. This was all the wizard beasts that the sorcerers had modified in the past month. However, after sacrificing almost all of their wizard beasts, the sorcerers had only reaped a bunch of insignificant demon hunter knights. The only thing worth mentioning was the heads of the Magic Breaker Knight. The Magic Breaker Knights had suffered heavy losses. 34 of them had charged into the forest, but only 15 had managed to escape with the team. The rest had turned into skeletons, becoming a delightful achievement for the sorcerers. However, the 7 Radiant Knights, who were the higher-ups of the knights, were still standing strong. Whether it was the continuous attacks of the wizard beasts and ghouls, or the sneak attacks of the sorcerers, they could not shake the rock-solid defense of the Radiant Knights. It was the black smoke that filled the jungle. Apart from making them spit out 2 mouthfuls of blood and become a little dispirited, there were no other signs of it. The Radiant Knights had an enviable defense against this terrifying fungus that could destroy the balance of the runic energy in their bodies. Of course, it could also be that their bodies could withstand this degree of damage and still maintain their combat power. It could be said that even the Magic Breaker Knights and the Demon Hunter Knights were unable to continue halfway. They staggered as they followed the faintly glowing figures of the Radiant Knights. Their bodies were in turmoil and they were in a mess. The remaining runic energy, under the influence of the black smoke, destroyed their internal organs in a frenzy, causing them to vomit blood every time they walked. It was a purplish-black bloody paste filled with broken organs. The Magic Breaker Knights had a better physique, so they managed to retain some combat power. However, he no longer dared to channel the rune energy into his body. As a result, the rune sword in his hand once again became an ordinary longsword, losing its sharpness and fearsomeness. The Demon Hunter Knights, on the other hand, had completely lost their ability to fight back. They were like plague victims, following the group like the Walking Dead. They had lost the ability to resist and could only rely on the protection of the Spellbreaker Knights and the Radiant Knights. Perhaps it was because of this that the sorcerers commanded their wizard beasts and ghouls to stop massacring the demon hunters. Instead, they tried to inflict as much damage as they could on the demon hunters. However, they did not kill the demon hunters, allowing the heavily injured demon hunters to remain in their rank. This undoubtedly slowed down their pace even more. The 7 Radiant Knights and the 15 Magic Breaker Knights were the only defense for the 200 demon hunters. Every time a large number of wizard beasts swarmed over, the 7 Radiant Knights would have to fight on the front lines, using their strong bodies and terrifying combat skills to destroy the enemies. The 15 Magic Breaker Knights, on the other hand, guarded the demon hunters, using their thin bodies and dim rune swords to kill the enemies, slowly whittling down their numbers. It could be said that after such a long time of preparation and effort, the demon hunters were exhausted, and their combat power had fallen to the bottom. It was precisely because of this that when Wizard Hyde made the suggestion, no one immediately rejected it. Instead, they became eager to try it out. The first wave of attacks was naturally from a few elemental sorcerers, especially Grimm and Thunderbird. After all, among all the elemental sorcery, fire sorcery was recognized as the most suitable for large-scale killing. Although Thunderbird's lightning sorcery was not weak, the lightning came and went quickly. In terms of derivative damage, it was far inferior to the fire sorcery. Therefore, when Thunderbird and Grimm started chanting spells at the same time on a hill a mile away from the demon hunters, the sky in the distance once again turned into an apocalyptic scene. Above them were rolling red clouds with raging flames, and below them was a raging thunderstorm. When the fiery meteors whistled down, dragging long tails of black smoke behind them, the forest where the knights were in had been destroyed by the violent lightning. There were scorched dead trees everywhere with black smoke rising in spirals. A few radiant knights urged the demon hunters to leave the area where the spells were wreaking havoc, and at the same time, they used their flame blades to cut down every falling meteor. Although they had done their best, there were still some fiery meteors falling on the demon hunters. Outside the core of the fiery meteors was a solid lava shell, and inside it was liquid lava with a temperature of more than 3,000 degrees Celsius and abundant fire elements. When they fell to the ground, apart from creating a huge crater, the outer shell of the lava would suddenly explode, and the violent fire elements would roll up the bone-piercing magma and shoot out in all directions. Without the necessary energy protection, even the physique of the Magic Breaker Knights would not be able to withstand the terrifying lava rain and the terrifying flame flow. As for the demon hunters, they were destined to die the moment they were sucked into the falling meteors. What was more terrifying was that even after the attack, the fiery magma had cooled down, and outsiders would not be able to find their remains in the fire. They were either burnt to a crisp, incinerated into ashes, or solidified in the molten rocks. It was a classic case of not even leaving a corpse behind, as the demon hunter's physical strength was at its limit, even though they only needed to move 20 to 30 meters to escape the range of the terrifying spells. They could only struggle and wail in the sea of fire. They would only fall to the ground when they exhausted their last bit of life. The radiant knights and the spell-breaking knights charged into the sea of fire, grabbed them, and threw them out of the sea of fire with all their might. They wailed and wailed in agony, their hands trembling as they reached out their hands for help. However, at this moment, under the guidance of the sorcerers, the flaming clouds in the sky slowly moved towards the area where the demon hunters were gathered. Charles looked at the scene in front of him with widened eyes, and his ears were filled with the wails of the demon hunters before they died. He turned around angrily, and was about to slash that damned sorcerer to death with his sword. However, at this moment, a tall figure blocked his way. "You stay here and lead the others to break out of the encirclement. I'll go." Muscle grabbed his arm and shouted in a hoarse voice. He then turned around and rushed into the forest. A mile of mountain road was nothing to an angry radiant knight. When the meteor shower in the sky had just passed the middle stage and was about to turn into the final stage, the angry Muscle quickly approached the mountain where the spellcaster was. Even without Wizard Hyde's message, Grim and Thunderbird had each used their own methods to detect Muscle's approach. Facing a furious Grade 2 Radiant Knight, the two sorcerers did not dare to let their guard down. The moment Muscle approached the mountain top, they had already tried to stop the spells from afar. Muscle rushed to the top of the mountain in one breath. When he saw the two vigilant evil sorcerers, he immediately realized something. Perhaps he had already thought about this problem before he came here. That was why Muscle stopped his impulsive old friend and came by himself. Looking at the scene he was most worried about had finally become reality. Muscle was still fearless. He calmly walked out of the dark forest. "Tell your men to come out." Muscle waved his sword lightly, and the scorching flames once again engulfed the entire blade. Even if he was exhausted, even if he was covered in smoke, even if he was surrounded by powerful enemies, when the rune energy surged crazily in his body again, the radiant knight Muscle held his sword horizontally. He still had a domineering aura that could send chills down people's spines. However, this had no effect on wizards whose minds were already so tough that they could not be shaken by anything. Along with a sneer, the evil worm, Hyde, Marionette, and Mary appeared in the forest behind Muscle and surrounded him in a triangular formation. Phantom and Evil Shadow were still nowhere to be seen. Both of them were support-type spells. Hiding in the dark and launching sneak attacks was far more threatening than launching a direct attack on the battlefield. Although the one caught in the net was not the knight leader they had expected, he was still a Grade 2 knight. Therefore, they did not slack off and immediately launched a fierce attack according to their previous agreement. 6 wizards and 6 single-target attack spells engulfed Muscle's figure in an instant. After the first round of attacks, everyone quickly moved away from their original positions. As they changed positions, they quickly prepared for the second round of attack. With the power of their attacks, it was impossible to kill a Grade 2 knight in one round. Therefore, they had long since prepared to slowly kill their opponent. As expected, a swift and violent flame blade flew horizontally across the ground, passing by Grimm's side by a hair's breadth. A row of trees behind him was cut into burning torches. In the next second, Muscle forcefully rushed out of the violent elemental whirlpool against his energy shield. Wizard Hyde roared and dashed forward to meet Muscle's charge. As the only mechanical wizard present, a branch of arcane wizards, Hyde could temporarily act as a meat shield when there were no body refinement wizards around. As he rapidly approached his opponent, Hyde's thick left mechanical arm began to tremble slightly, activating a semicircular energy light shield to protect his body. The front end of his right mechanical arm suddenly began to spin rapidly, then turned into a violent sharp cone that shot towards Muscle's chest. Without a sound, the skin on Hyde's back split open, and 5 or 6 palm-sized discs spun and flew out, rapidly attacking Muscle's ribs from both sides. Chapter 213. However, these tricks were useless against a Grade 2 knight. Without using any knight battle skills, Musser simply chopped and swung his sword to shatter the rotating blades. Then, he calmly swept his sword across the flying awl that was coming at his chest. Strangely, the sharp awl shattered upon contact, instantly breaking into dozens of smaller awls that rapidly pierced towards various parts of Muscle's body. Under normal circumstances, such a simple attack would not have been able to harm Muscle in the slightest. Unfortunately, today was clearly not Muscle's lucky day. Muscle roared, and his sword broke through the barrage of bullets. He rushed out of the encirclement and slashed heavily at the energy barrier in front of Hyde. With just one slash, the energy barrier shattered into pieces, and Hyde was sent flying into the forest, screaming miserably. Muscle grunted as 4 dark red blood spots appeared on his body at the same time. Even though those damned sharp awl fragments had pierced into his flesh, they were still spinning. Furthermore, they were constantly releasing some strange poison, causing him to lose his sense of the flesh around him. Muscle patted his chest heavily. Under the pressure of the violent chi, the 4 fragments shot out again with puffing sounds. Along with them came streams of sticky white pus, and there was a faint smell of bitter almonds in the air. Muscle simply dealt with his wounds. Just as he was about to take advantage of the situation to rush over and kill that detestable Magus, he suddenly felt his legs tighten. Thorny vines had shot out from the ground and coiled around him. There was a terrifying snake head at the end of each bramble vine's tentacle, and it was currently drilling into the greaves on his legs, causing them to creak. Muscle suddenly raised his head, and his gaze instantly fell on the Magus at the edge of the forest, who looked and behaved like a puppet. At this moment, he was silently sticking close to a large tree. His legs had already sunk into the soil, and his hands were inserted into the trunk of the tree. One could faintly hear the sound of sucking. Taking advantage of the opportunity when the Radiant Knight was trapped by the puppet, the surrounding Magi did not hesitate to launch their most ferocious attacks. Not far away, the demonic insect, Indeek, raised his right hand horizontally. A huge black hole suddenly appeared in his jet-black palm, and countless terrifying flying insects flew out with a buzz, swarming toward the Radiant Knight. Within the swarm of flying insects, there were a dozen strange beetles with black shells, green wings, and liver mortis spots on their back. Bloody Mary did not recklessly charge at the Tier 2 Radiance Knight. Instead, she unfurled her bat wings and pulled her blood-red longbow to its fullest. Instantly, the violent and ferocious blood energy around her reached its peak. There was a crisp sound. The arrow left the bowstring. In the sky, a pillar of white lightning that was as thick as a bucket came crashing down. Its target was also the Radiant Knight, who was trapped in place and unable to move. In the blink of an eye, the puppet trapped the enemy, and the 3 Magi used their killing moves at the same time, immediately putting Muscle in a dangerous situation. Faced with the simultaneous attacks from the front, back, and top of his head, Musser raised the rune sword in his hand high. When the energy in his body was brewed to the maximum, he let out a loud roar and stabbed the sword into the ground. In the next second, the berserk and unstoppable runic energy seeped into the ground and then exploded. What kind of power would a Grade 2 knight have when he went all out? Grim, who was standing 50 meters behind Muscle, instantly felt the elemental vision in front of him turn bright red. All sorts of energy data projected by the AI chip rose rapidly, and the ear-piercing warning of danger did not stop for even a moment. These abstract data could not even fully describe the scene in front of Grim. The earth was cracking, the forest was trembling, and the entire sky was dyed blood-red on the ground. Fine cracks like a spider's web quickly spread outwards with the rune's sword at the center. However, the speed at which they spread was obviously not as fast as the few thick cracks in the ground. Terrifying, bottomless ravines twisted and twisted on the ground as they extended outwards. Wherever they passed, ancient trees toppled, the earth cracked, and huge pillars of dust shot up into the sky. On the ground, a ring-shaped violent hurricane swept through the area like an invisible razor, flattening everything on the ground. Countless grass, mud, and withered leaves were swept up by the hurricane and scattered into the surrounding forest. With Muscle at the center, there were no plants or vegetation within a radius of 100 meters. Even a layer of the ground had been flattened. 100 meters away, countless tall ancient trees fell outwards in a ring, perfectly displaying the terrifying energy contained in the violent strike of a radiant night. Under such a destructive force, no one's attack could break through the invisible barrier of energy. When the violent tide of energy gradually began to recede, everything in the field returned to everyone's sight. The previously tight circle of attacks had now become sparse and sparse. The slender and light Mary was obviously not known for her strength, so she was directly swept away by the first wave of energy and disappeared without a trace. The demonic insect wasn't much better off. Not only was it unable to stand, it could only transform into its insect form and stab its limbs into the soil. Even the flying insect subordinates it summoned were blown into thin threads. Only a dozen or so carrion beetles struggled together, forming an evil beetle shield to block the subsequent wave of energy attacks. It must be known that in that moment, other than the raging waves of energy, there were also countless scattered fragments of energy. These fragments of energy, comparable to the sharpness of divine weapons, were hidden in the tide-like energy waves, and were enough to dismember any creature caught in them. Puppet, who had taken on the brunt of the energy attack, was in an even more miserable state. Not only were the roots on its legs broken, even Succubus' body, which was exposed on the ground, was riddled with holes. Visible to the naked eye, there were 3 to 4 penetrating wounds on its woody body. As for the sporadic wounds, they were even more densely packed. After suffering such heavy injuries, Puppet's life force instantly fell to rock bottom. At this moment, the insufferably domineering Muscle had just pulled out his longsword from the soil. His majestic body stood ramrod straight, and his gaze landed on the few miserable magi. A trace of a disdainful smile appeared on his face. "You scoundrels who only know how to hide, now I'll let you." Muscle's voice was muffled like thunder, but halfway through his sentence, his expression suddenly changed, and he spat out a mouthful of purplish-black blood. In the next moment, even his body began to tremble. A few magi had sharp eyes, and immediately discovered some fragments of internal organs in the blood. Hee! A sinister laughter rang out from outside the field, mixed with the sound of metal clanging. "You know that this forest has been covered by the terrifying poisonous fungus, yet you still dare to absorb the runic energy into your body so fiercely? The ignorant are indeed fearless. Now you've suffered from the energy backlash, haven't you? How about it? How many more attacks like that can you unleash? Here, the more ferocious the energy you stimulate, the faster you die. Kakik. I think you'd better obediently lie down and wait for your death." Metal clanged, and a robot pushed away the sand, branches, and leaves on its body. It emerged from the ground and strode towards Muscle, who was leaning on his sword. The rest of the Magi also appeared around him, trapping him in the middle. "Attack!" Following Hyde's shout, everyone moved in unison, and another wave of ferocious attacks engulfed the knight's body. 2 miles away, Charles had just led the group out of the encirclement. As they gathered in a sparse forest for a short rest, Charles suddenly stood up from the mountain rock and gazed into the distance at a certain place behind him. There, a vast and surging energy aura was erupting. This aura was so familiar that he almost subconsciously called it out. Muscle! With the strength of a rank 2 knight, he would not normally use such an extravagant method of energy eruption. This kind of energy attack seemed to have a wide area of effect, but it was extremely wasteful in terms of energy. It was far less destructive than a knight's battle technique of condensing energy. This kind of grand and imposing knight battle technique could only be liked by knights who had just grasped the method of using energy. However, Radiant Knights knew that a scarlet flame attack that covered 10 meters was far less powerful than a sword strike that was condensed with energy. Muscle was a veteran Radiant Knight, and it was impossible for him not to understand this principle. Yet, he had made such a childish mistake. This meant that he was either facing an enemy several times stronger than him, or that he could no longer control the energy in his body. No matter which of the two situations it was, it showed how bad his current situation was. You guys lead the group and continue forward. I'll bring Muscle back. Before the violent shout had even dissipated, Charles had already disappeared from the scene. A pair of strange energy wings extended from Charles's back, which also gave him the ability to fly short distances. Tall ancient trees whizzed past him, and the dense branches slapped against his face and body. He had already poured most of his energy into the energy wings, and did not have any extra energy to protect himself. Thus, he did his best to widen his eyes, and clumsily adjusted his body as he charged forward, trying his best to avoid the trees. As for the dense branches and vines, he no longer had the energy to dodge them, and could only rely on his strong body to resist them. With the ability to fly, he could cover a distance of 2 kilometers in the blink of an eye. A moment later, the barren battlefield appeared in his field of vision. On top of a small hill that had nearly half collapsed, Muscle's hunched body was curled up into a ball, and he was doing his best to resist the surrounding magic attacks that were like a storm. Flames, lightning, blood arrows, wooden spikes, sharp awls, all sorts of terrifying magic rained down on Muscle's body, almost turning him into a sieve. Charles's eyes were wide open, and he let out a violent roar. The energy wings retracted, and he instantly landed beside Muscle. He swung the large sword in his hand, and a ferocious and violent force swept out, annihilating all the attacks in the surroundings in the bright red sword light. Muscle, hold on, I'm going to. Charles swung the long sword with one hand, shattering the incoming magic attacks, and picked up Muscle with the other, intending to rush out of the battlefield. Chapter 214. Charles had already imagined all sorts of possible encounters when he had charged into the fray. He had never dared to underestimate the craftiness of Magi. Unfortunately, the current situation had exceeded the limits of his imagination. He had actually been attacked by Muscle. Muscle's eyes were wide open, his gaze unfocused. Tears of blood flowed from the corners of his eyes, and he could not help but let out strange sounds. His hands were emitting intense energy rays, which had already sunk deep into Charles's waist. Some unknown things were continuously being injected into him. Charles endured the intense pain and pressed his left hand against Muscle's chest. Dense energy rays began to gather rapidly. As long as he exerted some strength, he would be able to easily shake off Muscle's entanglement. However, looking at Muscle's familiar face and sensing the weak heartbeat under his palm, Charles found it difficult to activate the power he had gathered. This was an old comrade he had known for over 40 years. Although his mind had been bewitched by the evil Magi and he had become a lackey, his life force had not been extinguished. If Charles were to blast him away with an energy explosion, with Muscle's weakened body, he would probably be snuffed out with his own hands. At the thought of this, Charles could not help but tear up. His palm, which was pressed against his old friend's chest, was trembling. Muscle had probably been defeated and captured, and the scene of him being besieged by the Magi was simply a rehearsed show. Everything had been to lure him into a trap. At this moment, Charles finally saw it clearly. His old friend Muscle's legs had been pierced by thorns, and he was firmly locked in place. 7 or 8 strange transparent threads had pierced out from the ground and pierced into various parts of his body. This was probably the reason why he had lost control of his actions. Using Muscle's hands that had pierced into Charles's body as a bridge, waves of unknown things were constantly entering his body. Some of them were tiny living creatures that were crazily gnawing at his flesh and organs. Some of them were cursed halos that kept erupting in his body, causing his consciousness and physique to rapidly weaken. Apart from that, the evil magi around the battlefield did not hold back at all. Powerful spells rained down on them, not caring if they would accidentally injure Muscle, who was on their side. Just as Charles hesitated for a moment, the rain-like witchcraft had already drowned him and Muscle. The violent and ferocious elemental explosion and the rampaging elemental wave continued to erupt, turning this place into a living hell. Even a Tier 2 Radiance Knight would find it hard to endure such a powerful elemental corrosion. So with a painful roar that shook the forest, Knight Charles rushed out of the energy storm vortex like a mad tiger, and his left hand was still tightly holding Muscle's body. Yes, after the previous round of ferocious attacks, the Radiant Knight Massa, who was on the verge of death, had finally reached the end of his life. His heart had stopped beating. His body, which had lost the protection of his energy, was corroded by the violent elemental waves and was riddled with holes. He no longer looked human. Not to mention Muscle, even Knight Charles looked extremely miserable at the moment. His left eye had been blinded by the explosion, and blood was gushing out of the huge bloody hole. His body looked as if he had just been fished out of a meat grinder, and there were terrifying crisscrossing wounds all over his body. As soon as he rushed out of the energy vortex, he let go of the rune longsword and stabbed his right hand into the flesh of his waist. With a dull thud, a small-scale energy explosion occurred in his body. Purplish-black blood and minced meat splattered everywhere. When Charles pulled his bloody hand out of the bloody hole in his waist, he was actually holding a strange beetle that was constantly hissing and struggling. Although the strange beetle was temporarily stunned by Charles's energy explosion, it became active again the moment it left his body. It kept hissing and gnawing at Charles's palm in a frenzy. Charles roared and clenched his 5 fingers together. The strange beetle finally could not withstand the energy explosion of a Tier 2 knight, and was instantly crushed into a ball of blood paste. Following the death of the strange beetle, the muffled groan of the demonic insect, Endic, came from the distant forest. It was obvious that the death of the larvae of the carrion beetle had caused him a considerable backlash. The energy explosion just now was obviously too much for Charles's heavily injured body to bear. The flesh on both sides of his ribs had been blasted away by the energy explosion in his body. After swaying a few times, he finally could not help but kneel down. The heavy injuries on his body, as well as the curse that was difficult to get rid of, were the last straw that broke the camel's back. The backlash from using a large amount of rune energy just now, in addition to the day and night of squeezing his body's potential, made him finally unable to suppress the injuries in his body. Kneeling on the ground, the world before his eyes spun and swayed continuously. The intense pain from his body frequently assaulted his mind, and the impact caused his consciousness to gradually blur. "You evil wizards!" Charles's damaged lips moved slightly, as if he wanted to use the last bit of his strength to scold the enemy. Unfortunately, his broken body did not allow him to continue. Charles's head tilted, and just like that, he fainted. It had to be said that the body of a Tier 2 Radiant Knight, which had been immersed in rune energy for a long time, had indeed surpassed the limits of a human. His body was broken beyond recognition, and there was not much flesh left between his chest and abdomen. Most of his internal organs had already turned into a bloody paste, but even with such terrifying injuries, he still did not die. The strength of a Tier 2 Radiant Knight could be seen from this. However, His injuries were so severe that even if the sorcerers did not attack him, his broken body had already lost the ability to repair itself. Sooner or later, he would reach the end of his life. Many sorcerers gathered around Charles, and after checking his condition, they could not help but have a heated discussion. At this point in the war, the harvest of the two Radiant Knights had already satisfied everyone, especially the leader of the Radiant Knights, who was even more of a rare character. Moreover, at this time, news came from the front line that the demon hunters in the camp at the edge of the forest had already set off in large numbers, and were rapidly approaching. Therefore, the sorcerers who had fought hard for a night could not help but think of retreating. This day and night of hard fighting had caused the demon hunters to suffer heavy losses, and more than 2/3 of their forces had been lost. However, the sorcerers did not fare well either. The wizard beast army that they had painstakingly built was almost completely destroyed, and even one sorcerer had fallen. If not for the group of elite ghouls and the two Radiant Knights, this battle could be said to be a huge loss. Therefore, when they saw a large number of elite demon hunters suddenly enter the forest, the sorcerers could only command the remaining wizard beast army to retreat. Near a call 20 miles deep into the forest, the surging reinforcements converged with the remaining wizard beast army. When Winsoul rushed into the forest on his demonic colt, he was immediately shocked by the tragic scene before him. Once upon a time, the majestic and mighty demon hunters were the greatest pride of this world. Whenever there was news of evil wreaking havoc, this group of proud demon hunters would mount their demonic colts and travel thousands of miles to fight bravely. Wherever they went, it could be said that evil was repelled, and darkness was extinguished. It was because of their generosity, aggressive attitude, and enthusiasm that the entire plain presented a scene of prosperity. Even in the two rare wars against evil in history, it was more about the glorious deeds of the demon hunter knights who fought bravely to be the first and slaying the evil. Those evildoers might be able to wreak havoc for a while, but once the proud and honorable demon hunter knights found them, they would vanish into thin air in an instant, and the world would return to its former glory. However, the scene that he had witnessed today had deeply shocked Winsoul. In the dark forest, the demon hunters who had abandoned their armor were swaying left and right. On their bodies, there were traces of terrifying wizard beast bites on their faces. Their eyes were empty and numb, and they clustered around each other. Even when they saw the arrival of reinforcements, there was no expression of surprise, or anything similar on their faces. If not for the slight rise and fall of their chests, Winsoul would have thought that he was looking at a group of clay statues carved from a mixture of blood and mud. Finally, a familiar face covered in mud and blood appeared in front of Winsoul. He could not help but stop his demonic colt. "Jose, how did you suffer the attack? How did you suffer such heavy losses in just one day? Where's Charles?" A series of questions were thrown at him, but in return, the Radiant Knight named Jose only responded weakly. "Gone, all gone," Jose murmured. "They're all gone." Hearing his hoarse and mournful cry, the exhausted and numb remaining army in the forest finally began to cry, and it quickly spread. A wave of grief, anger, and even deep sorrow rose in the forest, and all the reinforcements could not help but shed tears. It was too tragic. It was simply too tragic. A day ago, it was a team of nearly 1,000 demon hunters who stepped into the forest passionately. But now, after searching the entire call, including the Radiant Knights and the Magic-Breaking Knights, there were only 172 of them. Moreover, these knights who were lucky enough to escape were covered in wounds, physically and mentally exhausted, and their spirits were at rock bottom. Winsoul could not even see the pride and glory of being a demon hunter knight in them. Not to mention the ordinary demon hunters, even the powerful Radiant Knights looked haggard at the moment. Their internal and external injuries were so severe that it made one's heart palpitate. Winsoul looked at the dark forest in the distance. With his powerful war instincts, he could sense the presence of the enemy. If it were in the past, he would have led his men into the darkness and killed wantonly, using the blood of the enemy to reignite the passion of his companions. But at this moment, the dark forest had become unprecedentedly terrifying. Even a grade 2 radiant knight like him could not help but feel a little afraid. Perhaps the best thing to do is to wait for new reinforcements to arrive before conducting a large-scale search? He thought silently. Chapter 2:15. Dragon Cliff. For the humans living on the Night Continent, Dragon Cliff was a rather taboo name. Although there was no shortage of bards describing the magnificence of Dragon Cliff in taverns and inns of all sizes on the continent, there was no shortage of them foaming at the mouth. But as for the location of Dragon Cliff, most people only heard about it from hearsay. There was not the slightest bit of credibility. It was said that it was where the dragons lived and multiplied. It was said that there were mountains of wealth there. It was said that it was the burial place of countless arrogant people who wanted to challenge the dragons and become dragon knights. But where was Dragon Cliff? No one could know. It was a secluded valley in the boundless mountains. This undulating mountain range stretched out in all directions. There were broad and tall trees on it. The green forest covered a vast area of thousands of kilometers. Towering mountains could be seen everywhere, and terrifying deep ravines covered every corner of the land. Because of the dense forest and the numerous beasts, it was one of the dangerous places that humans could not set foot in. However, in the center of the beautiful and secluded valley, there was a towering cliff with dragon roars. It was the legendary majestic Dragon Cliff that no one could find. It was the afternoon when the sun was the brightest. The great green dragon O'Farrell had just had a full meal in the outer forest. It flapped its huge membranous wings and flew around the Dragon Valley once before landing beside a small lake. Some herbivores such as bison, antelope, and blue zebra that were drinking by the lake were scared and ran away. They vigilantly watched the uninvited green dragon from afar. It was not until they found out that it had eaten its fill that they became much more relaxed. After lying by the lake and drinking the clear lake water, O'Farrell curled up its membranous wings in satisfaction and paced on the grass by the lake with its hands and feet. The weather was so beautiful that it could not help but want to have a good sleep. However, as a guard of the Dragon Valley, it also had the task of guarding the entrance of the Dragon Valley from foreign invasion. So it could only snort discontentedly and spit out a cloud of light green smoke from its nostrils. Only then did it manage to dispel its heavy sleepiness. Suddenly, O'Farrell stood up and raised its nose to sniff a few times. In the natural fragrance of the grass, it seemed to detect a trace of foreign aura that did not belong to the Dragon Valley. It was a human. Moreover, it was a familiar human. O'Farrell's thick hind legs kicked hard, and its heavy body bounced off the ground. Then, under the powerful flapping of its huge membranous wings, it left the ground with difficulty and flew towards the entrance of the valley. The dragon's body was too large, and it would be difficult for them to fly after landing on the ground. Therefore, they preferred to build their nests on the top of cliffs that were difficult for outsiders to approach. Over there, they had a wide field of vision, and it was very convenient for them to pounce on their enemies from above. After flying across the grassland for 10 to 20 miles, O'Farrell saw a familiar human figure at the entrance of the Dragon Valley. This was a tall and burly human man. He had shoulder-length golden hair, a golden headband, golden armor, golden bracelets, and golden combat boot. From top to bottom, from inside to outside, this strong human emitted the extravagance and vulgarity of a nouveau riche. All the ornaments and clothes on his body shone with a golden light, making it hard to look directly at them. However, it was this vulgar human man who exuded a powerful aura that was difficult for outsiders to reach. Even when the green dragon O'Farrell, whose body was as large as a hill, let out a loud dragon roar and swooped down at him, he did not have the slightest intention of dodging. Instead, he opened his arms and took the initiative to welcome him. With a dull thud, the huge green dragon landed lightly on the ground, creating a shallow pit that was 1 meter deep and 3 meters in diameter on the green grass. Only then did it hug the strong human affectionately. In fact, the so-called embrace was just the green dragon reluctantly placing its head in front of the strong human man, allowing him to hug it. Willis, why do you have the time to come to the Dragon Valley? Could it be that the human king is willing to let you go? Although the green dragon had tried his best to control his voice, it still caused the surrounding void to buzz. Oh, Farrell, it's a long story. I'll chat with you when I have time. Right now, I want to see Chief Ricelin. Please help me pass the message. The green dragon hesitated. Willis, after you sent the heavily injured Lysana back 2 days ago, the chief has become very angry. A few elders are trying to save poor Lysana, I'm afraid. Oh, Farrell, I'm also a member of the Dragon Valley. Has the chief banned me from entering? Willis asked loudly. Once he was angry. His domineering aura as a grade 4 holy paladin was something even a grade 3 green dragon could not withstand. That's not true. The green dragon's long face showed a hint of awkwardness. All right then, I'll give it a try. As for whether the chief will see you or not, I can't guarantee that. With that, the green dragon Farrell turned around and opened his mouth, letting out a long, rhythmic dragon roar towards the towering dragon cliff 60 to 70 kilometers away. A moment later, an even louder dragon roar came from the towering dragon cliff. All right, the chief has agreed to see you. Come with me. Following a storm of sand and pebbles, the green dragon Farrell once again rose into the sky with great difficulty. The grade 4 holy paladin Olus, who was clad in golden armor, hit his chest hard. His body twisted and expanded strangely, quickly transforming into a green dragon that was even more majestic than Farrell. With a series of resonant dragon roars, the 2 green dragons flew towards the distant dragon cliff one after the other. Compared to the boundless forest outside the valley, there weren't many tall, ancient trees in the valley. This place was covered in lush green grassland and dotted with lakes that were like the stars in the sky, adding to the beautiful and magnificent scenery of a paradise. As they flew closer and closer, the towering and majestic dragon cliff finally revealed its full appearance. This was a towering cliff that occupied an area of thousands of acres. The steep cliffs were filled with pitch-black caves. Sensing Willis's arrival, the green dragon's long, malevolent head poked out of the caves, letting out loud dragon roars to greet them. The green dragon that Willis had transformed into also responded with a loud dragon roar. For a moment, the dragon roars shook the heavens above and below the dragon cliff. On the green grass at the bottom of the cliff, a group of green dragon whelps that were only 3 to 5 meters tall were playing beside the clear lake. From time to time, they would flap their small wings and move their round bodies into the sky with difficulty, then dive into the lake. There were also some whelps that playfully chased behind the herbivores, driving them away in all directions. It could be seen that these whelps were still not proficient in spitting out poisonous fog. Therefore, there were always some clumsy fellows that flew too low and couldn't control their bodies properly. They crashed into the grass, then crawled there and cried. Every time this happened, 1 or 2 majestic green dragon parents would fly out of the dragon cliff's cave, dive down, and skillfully use their dragon claws to pierce through the herbivores' bodies, then throw them to the side of the whelps. Therefore, a group of whelps swarmed up, either spitting out poisonous fog or spitting green saliva. When their prey was poisoned to death, they would happily pounce on it, using their newly grown sharp fangs to tear at the flesh of their prey. This bloody and cruel scene was so warm and sweet in the eyes of Willis, who was also a green dragon. As a half-dragon, the blood flowing in his veins was the noble giant dragon bloodline. The green dragon chief, Ricelin, received Willis in the conference hall. Located in the middle of the high cliff, this wide hall could accommodate 20 to 30 giant dragons. Therefore, it was the most important sacred place on the dragon cliff, apart from the dragon altar at the top of the cliff. Usually, only when there were important and difficult matters, Chief Raislin would gather the giant dragons here for a meeting. Therefore, when Willis transformed into his human form and walked into the conference hall, an ominous feeling rose in his heart. There were 3 giant dragons waiting here. The Green Dragon Chief, Raislin, and the Green Dragon Elders, Seng and Vadim. All of them had the terrifying strength of a Type 4 divine warrior. "Welcome, my child." The Green Dragon Chief, Raislin's loud voice caused the hall to buzz. "I hope you brought us good news this time." "What kind of good news does Father need?" Willis asked in a low voice. "We smelled the aura of evil sorcerers on Lysana, who you sent back. I hope your visit this time is not related to this." Raislin crouched down, his ferocious head approaching Willis, who was only a little more than 2 meters tall, his huge amber eyes staring at him without blinking. "Great Father, I may have brought you news that you do not wish to hear." A pained expression appeared on Willis's face. "His Majesty the Human King asked me to bring you a message. He hopes that the powerful Dragon Cliff can send the giant dragons to reinforce the front lines on account of their years of worship. It is said that the war there is not going well. The sorcerers are holed up in the Greenland forest, causing great casualties to the demon hunters." "Then what is your attitude?" Raislin's ferocious face was expressionless. "My child." Chapter 216. Relis and the other 2 green dragons looked at each other, and a loud voice sounded once more. "You've disappointed me, my child. As a half-dragon who grew up in a greenhouse, you've never experienced the bloody and cruel planar wars. Do you think that by relying on your dragon bloodline to reach rank 4, you'll be able to do as you please in this plane? Wrong, you're wrong." Relis angrily straightened his dragon body and roared loudly. "Tier 4 is nothing at all. In this plane, a rank 4 can only be considered a qualified recruit in a planar war. What is it that is attacking this time? Magi. Evil Magi. I'm sure you've heard of the cruelty of the Magi. Now that the evil Magi have set their sights on this pitiful plane, do you think there's a need for us to participate in this war just for some insignificant human offerings?" Facing the interrogation of his father, the mighty leader of the Green Dragons, Raislin, Willis's face revealed a pained and conflicted expression. But my father, the Magi that have invaded this plane are still very weak. If we gather all the clansmen in the Dragon Valley, there's still a possibility of driving them out." "Ha ha! My child, you're too childish. Staying in this peaceful and warm material plane for a long time has limited your thoughts to the narrow vision of a human reptile. So what if you've repelled the invading Magi? The invading Magus family might just be a small organization. Once their invasion fails, they'll sell the coordinates of your world to other organizations. At that time, the ones who will invade this world might be an even stronger Magus organization. We, the great dragons, have dealt with the evil sorcerers in countless planes. Their greed and cruelty are rarely seen even in a few of the more powerful planes. If we were strong enough, we could naturally seal them out of our territory once and for all. But we don't. We're just an insignificant green dragon branch of the Emerald Dragon clan in the Dragon Plane. Even if we gather the strength of our entire clan and fight to the death with them, it'll still be of no use. The growth of a dragon can be calculated in thousands of years. Before our new members can grow up, a new batch of invading Magi will appear. When the coordinates of this world were revealed to the evil Magi, the fate of this world was already sealed." Willis closed his eyes in pain. As the descendant of the Green Dragon tribe's leader Raislin and a certain human native girl, Willis had the mixed bloodline of a half-human half-dragon. On one hand, he was a citizen of the Dragon Valley. On the other hand, he was the supreme leader of all the demon hunters in the human kingdom. He was also the most trusted right-hand man of the human king. Now, he had come bearing the trust of His Majesty the King, but it was difficult to convince his stubborn and conservative green dragon father. Thus, he was stuck between a rock and a hard place, and the pain and struggle in his heart was indescribable. "Father, I know you have no feelings for those humans, but now your son has come from 1,000 miles away to make the most sincere request to you. Are you willing to let him return empty-handed? Please save the people and living beings in this plane." In the face of Willis's emotional attack, Raislin, the leader of the Green Dragons, was clearly in a dilemma. He loudly argued with the two elders, and the atmosphere was very tense. Finally, Raislin turned around and yelled at Willis, "I respect your choice. Since you are willing to fight for the humans, then you can choose to leave. If there are dragons in the Dragon Valley who are willing to travel with you, I will not force them. Remember, the embrace of the Dragon Valley will always be open for you. When you feel tired outside, I will still welcome you back. Now you can leave." Hearing his father's reply, Willis nodded painfully and turned to leave the conference hall. A moment later, Willis's impassioned declaration of war rang in the sky above the dragon cliff. For a moment, the dragons were in an uproar. Half a day later, Willis led the 3 green dragons across the sky and disappeared into the horizon. Raislin, the leader of the green dragons, who had used the ultimate transformation spell to transform into a human, stood in front of the huge hole in the conference hall. He stared at the silhouettes of the giant dragons from afar and asked softly, "Sing, is our choice right or wrong?" Elder Senj, who was also a level 4 green dragon, came to its side. His huge dragon eyes, which were filled with vicissitudes of life, flashed with the light of wisdom. "I have tried my best to predict this countless times. The leader of the sorcerers this time is a terrifying level 6 sorcerer. With the strength of the green dragons, it is impossible for us to fight against him. Even if we go all out, we can only delay the destruction of this plane for 100 or 200 years at most. But such an outcome is meaningless to our green dragon race. Unless you can get reinforcements from the higher race of the green dragons, the emerald dragons, we can only accompany the destruction of this plane. I only said the future scene that I saw through the dragon altar. This is also the most common possibility among the many future scenes. As for the specific choice, it is up to you, leader. After all, the fate of more than 40 people in the Dragon Valley depends on you." Raislin was dejected. It had been 13 days since the last battle. The demon-hunting knights who had retreated from the forest abandoned the camp and led the team back to the vicinity of Blue Hill City. The sorcerers who had just fought a bloody battle heaved a sigh of relief. Taking advantage of this rare opportunity to rest, a large number of sorcerers swarmed into the depths of the forest and began to hunt the jungle creatures, as well as cook wizard beasts on a large scale. Some sorcerers with special methods were also sent to the vicinity of Blue Hill City, harassing the knights' camp day and night. Grimm, on the other hand, took this opportunity to hide in his underground palace and conduct all kinds of secret research. Just a few days ago, the 3rd batch of reinforcements arrived. This time, only 2 sorcerers came. A man and a woman, 2 level 3 sorcerers. Their arrival immediately made the sorcerers' camp full of confidence. The next day, the wizard tower that had been stagnant for many days resumed construction. At this point, the simple illusory barrier could no longer conceal the existence of the wizard tower of war. If the other party sent more dragon knights, they would be able to clearly see the tall wizard tower as soon as they entered the Greenland forest. The 2 level 3 sorcerers stayed in the camp to slowly adapt to the changes in the laws of this plane, while the rest of the sorcerers were busy with their own things. Grimm had also successfully obtained the information he wanted from Wizard Hyde. A list of the rune masters in the Night Plane. Unfortunately, almost all the rune masters were located near the faraway capital of the Kingdom of Knights, and they were under strict protection. Therefore, if Grimm wanted to get a glimpse of the profound knowledge of the fusion of rune energy and life energy in this plane, he would have to make a long journey. With the current situation, it was not realistic for him to leave the sorcerer's camp and travel to the native human world. At least until the end of the next war, Grimm could not leave the sorcerer's camp. Although the previous battle in the forest had hurt the demon hunter knights to the bone, after half a month of recuperation, coupled with the rush of new blood from all over the world, the knights' camp outside Blue Hill City was once again overcrowded. The number of demon hunter knights had also reached an unprecedented number of 5,000. Therefore, during this period of time, war drums were once again rumbling around the Greenland forest. The higher-ups of the knights offered high rewards to the bounty hunters, adventurers, mercenaries, and even some low-level thieves, turning the Greenland forest into a bustling market. Every day, countless small human exploration teams traveled through the forest, playing cat and mouse with the evil wizards, terrifying wizard beasts, and terrifying ghouls. Although most of the teams never returned, and became ingredients for the wizards to create humanoid wizard beasts, there were still some that slipped through the net. Piecemeal information brought back by the wizards allowed the higher-ups of the knights to vaguely grasp some information about the forest. Among them, the existence of the wizard's pagoda was hard to hide, and thus became a thorn in the side of the higher-ups of the knights. If not for the fact that the higher-ups of the knights had not arrived yet, a new war might have already begun. Under such a serious situation, Grimm opened up an underground palace 7 miles away from the camp. Using a large number of earth demon puppets and demon crocodile hunters, Grimm dug out a small underground palace that occupied an area of 5 acres, then transformed it into his own laboratory, and immersed himself in it every day. There were about 20 stone chambers in the underground palace, and an important wizard experiment was being conducted in every stone chamber. There were 4 to 5 fluorescent stones on the dark and damp stone walls, and with the help of their faint green glow, they could barely light up the surrounding area. Grimm appeared in the corridor with a heavy robe draped over his shoulders. After a moment's hesitation, he turned around and entered the first stone chamber on the left. In the empty stone chamber, there was only a large icicle placed on a stone platform in the middle, and there was nothing else. But even this icicle, which would take 3 people to wrap their arms around, was clearly not an ordinary item. It was precisely because of its existence that the temperature in the stone chamber was shockingly low, -157 degrees Celsius. The entire stone chamber was covered in frost, and even the floor, ceiling, and walls were covered in sparkling blue frost. If the stone walls had not been strengthened and protected by a wizard formation, Grimm was sure that the cold air would have seeped out of the stone chamber and turned the entire underground palace into a world of ice and snow. The only thing Grimm could do in the stone chamber was to stand in front of the icicle and use his elemental fire to continuously burn it. He would then slowly sense the traces of law energy released by the icicle after it melted. Yes, this icicle was a remnant of the battle between the Tier 2 Wizard Forgan and the Tier 2 Radiant Knight. In order to capture the Radiant Knight alive, Forgan did not hesitate to use the law energy to condense an icicle and freeze the Radiant Knight inside. Hence, this icicle was a manifestation of the law of ice. If not for Grimm's burning, the icicle might have automatically absorbed the water elemental energy in the surroundings to maintain its existence. Even if it eventually dissipated, it would only happen in a month or 2. During that time, any living creature that came into contact with it would suffer frost damage of up to 30 degrees Celsius. This was equivalent to an all-out attack from an advanced apprentice. Chapter 217. After the time it took to brew a cup of tea, Grimm used his elemental flames to melt away a thin layer of the icicle. He was the one who did the hard work, but the one who meticulously analyzed the composition of the icicle was the AI chip. After all, in terms of data collection and analysis, the AI chip was 10 times, no, 100 times stronger than him. This was still due to the limitations of his weak spiritual force. As his spiritual force grew, the AI chip's abilities would be amplified. Hence, Grimm put aside his thoughts of competing with the AI chip and focused on melting the icicle bit by bit. He then carefully analyzed the composition of the ice crystals, the characteristics of the arrangement of the spiritual elements, as well as the form of fusion between the spiritual and material elements. Among them, Grimm could sense the presence of spiritual elements everywhere. In his previous understanding, material was material, elemental was elemental, and spiritual force was spiritual force. The three of them existed in different forms, had different characteristics, and operated in completely different ways. However, after analyzing the icicle in front of him, Grimm painfully discovered that his previous understanding of these matters had been broken. The three did not seem to be independent entities that could not be fused together. In Grimm's understanding, material was the visible form of the material world. From the soil, firewood, and rivers to the mountains and seas, they were all part of the material world, and could be touched by the human senses. Hence, material was the foundation of the material world. In this aspect, the earth of his previous life was no different from this other world. On the other hand, the elements were a mysterious substance that could not be seen or touched. They were everywhere, at all times, like a boundless ocean that soaked the entire multiverse in it, rising and falling. From the perspective of the multiverse, the elements were balanced. However, if one looked at it from a certain point of view, the elements also had the phenomenon of tide. More or less, thick or thin, they were all different. The diversity of the material world was actually directly related to the density of the elemental particles it was in. In this aspect, there was a fundamental difference between the earth of his previous life and this other world. In the history of his previous life, there had been many gods, and there were also many mysterious ancient myths and legends. Those ancient gods and immortals seemed to be able to overturn rivers and seas, and were omnipotent. However, the earth of his later life had deprived them of this mysterious ability. If it was in the past, Grimm would only treat these rumors of ancient earth as the delusions and dreams of the ancients. But now, he didn't think so. Perhaps it was highly possible that the ancient earth was also a world filled with elemental energy. That was why the people of that era had the ability to transcend their weak physical bodies and control even greater power. However, as the elemental tide changed, the elemental energy on Earth began to fade. Therefore, humans were beaten back to their original state. They could only abandon mysticism and pick up the weapon of technology again. That was why the mysterious elements were the masterminds behind the changes in the material plane. So what exactly were elements? It was impossible for ordinary people to detect the elemental particles with their naked eyes. Even if you were immersed in it day and night, with countless elemental particles flowing in and out with every breath you took, you didn't have the means to directly sense and verify its existence. The only way for humans to come into contact with the elemental particles was through meditation, using the spirit as a bridge to carry out meditation, allowing the physical body to come into contact with the ethereal elemental particles. It was precisely because of the existence of elemental particles that the spirit became a kind of power. If ordinary people stared and stamped their feet, nothing would happen. Their weak power could not change the material plane in the slightest. However, if a great wizard stared and stamped his feet, the elemental particles that his spirit attracted would become a kind of power that could pry open the laws of the plane and the laws of the world, changing the color of the heavens and the earth and changing the course of rivers. In the past, Grimm had made a clear distinction between the three and had drawn a detailed boundary for them. But now, when he vaguely sensed the existence of the spirit elements in the ice pillar, his knowledge of the past inevitably cracked. He was very lucky to have successfully completed the elemental transformation of his body with the help of the flame scepter during his apprenticeship. This made his control over the fire elemental particles even more exquisite, allowing him to quickly become a powerful fire wizard as soon as he became a wizard. Many books had mentioned the term elemental transformation of the spirit in regards to the subsequent path of advancement. However, there was no detailed information on how to elemental transformation of the spirit, and it was even left blank. Grimm had once suspected that this was a way for Magus families to monopolize knowledge and gather talents. For Grade 1 Magi, the only way for them to continue improving was to join these families with ancient Magi inheritances and obtain the lost knowledge from them. Otherwise, they could only waste their time year after year, slowly groping their way out of the endless darkness. Although Magi had a long lifespan compared to mortals, their lives were still limited when it came to the endless search for Magi knowledge. Logically speaking, Grimm had just advanced to become an elemental magus, and he would probably spend the first 100 years consolidating his body and elemental transformation. He would only touch on the matter of elemental transformation after 100 years. However, he had already completed his body of fire, and was now worrying about elemental transformation 100 years in advance. Hence, it was rare for him to have a chance to interact with the spirit elements, so of course he would spare no effort in exploring it. Grimm's elemental affinity was towards fire elemental particles, while the Grade 2 Forgan's affinity was towards ice elemental particles. The huge difference in their attributes allowed Grimm to feel the backlash of the plane's ice law when he extended his mental strength into the ice elemental essence he had released after the ice pillar had melted. When he held the ice pillar with both hands and slowly burned it with elemental fire, a bone-chilling force of ice appeared on his body through the bridge of his spiritual force. When he released his hands to end his daily probing, Grimm's legs were already frozen in place. Even the slightest movement would cause ice crystals to continuously fall from his body. Apart from these external injuries, his spiritual force had also become sluggish. It was obvious that his fire innate talent was being suppressed by the power of ice. This was only the aftermath of a spell cast by a Grade 2 Ice Magus, but it was already able to suppress his fire innate talent. If Lord Forgan's opponent was not a Grade 2 knight but him, Grimm might not even be able to complete a complete spell before turning into an Iceman. Grade 1 Elemental Magi could only use their physical body to adapt to the elemental particles and use their spiritual force to guide them. What about Grade 2 Elemental Magi? What did they look like when they cast spells? These questions were hard to answer. Grimm could not help but let out a long sigh. It feels like I'm dissecting a Grade 2 Magus right now. Immediately after, he became vigilant and kept his mouth shut, looking left and right. Grimm heaved a sigh of relief when he found himself in the underground labyrinth that he had dug. At the same time, he warned himself that in this strange world, being cautious was the only way for the weak to protect themselves. After coming out of the first stone chamber, Grimm quickly entered the second stone chamber. On the stone platform here, a tall human figure with his chest open was lying on his back. Every secret part of his body had been seen without a doubt. The stone platform itself had been modified by Grimm into a special spell formation. It was slowly transmitting various elemental energies into the different organs of the human body. What Grimm needed to do every day was to constantly observe and record the effects of different elemental energies on the organs of the human body. After all, the person being dissected on the stone bed was a Magus Knight. In the Magus world, he would be considered a Magus. In the Magus world, if Grimm dared to openly dissect a Magus, he would definitely be hunted down by the entire Magus community. It was only in this foreign world that he had the opportunity to capture a Magus of the same rank as himself and dismember him like a lab rat without worrying about any repercussions. Even some of the more secretive and taboo research was permitted. This was perhaps what attracted Magi the most about the planar wars. The stone platform in the third secret room was densely packed with broken pieces of armor and some other indiscernible items. In the middle of the stone platform, the outline of a knight's armor had already been pieced together, and the rune formation inside could be seen clearly. After so many bloody battles in the forest, the Magi had killed and captured a certain number of magic hunters and magus knights. Hence, they had a basic understanding of the special runes of this plane. On the whole, the knowledge of runes in the night plane was far inferior to that of the magus world. However, when it came to the integration of runes and the human body, they had their own unique insights and progress. If they could snatch this knowledge and modify it a little, it would undoubtedly allow Magi who controlled powerful elemental energy to have the same powerful physical strength as knights. This would also increase the Magi's battle prowess, and it was a new piece of information that made people drool. However, the rune fragments that Grimm had collected were only at the level of a magus knight. There was not much information that could be used for reference. Hence, Grimm could only use quantity to replace quality. He collected all sorts of rune formations in an attempt to rely on the AI chip's powerful data analysis and deduction abilities to see through the mysteries of higher runes. Chapter 218 Blue Hill City. A large number of demon hunter knights gathered here, turning it into a bustling military camp. Knowing that he could not compete with the demon hunter knights, Count Winlier, the governor of Blue Hill City, simply gave up his mansion and moved to the Rose Manor outside the city, living a life of seclusion. But out of admiration for the demon hunter knights, he held some salon balls in the manor every few days and warmly invited the young knights to attend. In order to attract these young knights, Count Winlier even invited the most famous chefs from Hiduran City, as well as many noble ladies and beautiful women in Blue Hill City. Every day they would sing and dance, living a luxurious and happy life, enjoying delicious food and wine, surrounded by coquettish ladies, and listening to the flattery of rich merchants and nobles. Those noble knights who had just experienced the bloody battle in the forest seemed to have found the meaning of life once again. They were completely immersed in a life of pleasure, leading a befuddled and dreamy life. And Duke was one of them. Born in a small noble family, he had the great dream of riding a magic colt and traveling the world with a sword since he was a child. His father, a small baron in the countryside, sold his only small manor and sent him to the training camp of trainee demon hunter knights. Not only did he successfully become a demon hunter knight, but after 15 years of arduous training, he unexpectedly became a magic breaker knight. With that, he immediately became the pride of the entire family, and the famous leader of the local demon hunters. The success of killing evil people made him a firm defender of the demon hunter knights, and he also became a devout believer of the great holy knight Willis. Therefore, when the new evil war broke out, he also came here with his companions and joined the demon hunter knights last time. A cruel and bloody forest battle made him see for the first time the horror of evil wizards. Every time he recalled the evil wizard beasts that swarmed like tides in the dark forest, and his poor companions that mutated into ugly ghouls, his heart would bleed and his soul would tremble. The first few nights after returning from the forest, he woke up from terrible nightmares every day, drenched in cold sweat and depressed. Almost all the knights who returned with him suffered the same sequelae as him. Because of this, when Count Winlier held a lavish banquet and invited the knights to attend, the higher-ups of the knights who heard the news not only did not stop them, but also happily sent the traumatized knights over. Perhaps the broken faith of the knights could be compensated with wine and food, and perhaps the defeat on the battlefield could be won back in bed. In the spacious and bright banquet hall, there were handsome men and beautiful women seeking pleasure everywhere. Even the elderly were dressed immaculately, looking elegant and graceful. Most of the beautiful ladies were wearing gorgeous low-cut dresses, revealing their snow-white backs and deep ravines on their chests. The men, on the other hand, were wearing exquisite aristocratic dresses or free and easy hunting suit. From time to time, they would hold goblets of wine and chat loudly or invite the ladies to dance. Waiters in well-ironed uniforms pushed silver dining carts and placed exquisite food on a long table covered with a sky-blue tablecloth. This was for people of a certain status and position to enjoy. The table was filled with brass candlesticks, pewter cutlery, and horn goblets with silver rings. Beautiful waitresses with flower-like smiles shuttled between the distinguished guests with silver trays, serving glasses of wine to the guests who were drinking to their heart's content. At the edge of the hall there was a small band playing hard. From time to time, some bards and dancers would sing and dance impromptu, further igniting the atmosphere in the banquet hall. Outside the banquet hall, there were elegant and quiet corridors, parlors, arbors, fountains, lawns, and other places where men and women could have a heart-to-heart talk. Behind the banquet hall, there were small bedrooms that were specially partitioned. Not only were the decorations luxurious, but more importantly, the soundproofing was first class. However, in this joyous moment of feasting, in a secret wine cellar in a corner of the manor, several dark figures were secretly gathered together, discussing something in low voices. "Has the target been chosen? His lordship is getting impatient. Please report back to His Majesty. The target has been chosen. There are a total of 3 magic-breaking nights. Tonight we will find a way to keep them here, when that time comes. You must be careful. It was not easy to ambush you. His Majesty does not want you to be exposed too early, so you must be careful and arrange things carefully." "Yes, Lord Vulture, don't worry." "Yes." In the darkness, the few dark figures whispered to each other, and soon went their separate ways. One of them suddenly turned into a furry shadow, flapping its wings soundlessly as it quickly passed through the shadows of the manor's many buildings. Soon, it came to an exquisite stand-alone 2-story building at the back of the manor. Through an air vent left at the corner of the house, the black shadow entered the house, and then transformed into a slightly bald nobleman wearing an exquisite nightgown in the master bedroom. As he gently pulled on a special thread at the corner of the room, the 2 doors on the side of the master bedroom opened. A group of beautiful maids quickly walked in, and quickly helped the nobleman change into a luxurious suit. The butler in a tuxedo also stood respectfully at the side, quietly waiting for the Count's orders. "Have all the guests arrived?" The nobleman raised his arms, allowing the maids to tidy up his attire, as he asked with a nasal aristocratic tone. "Yes, everyone is here. I've already sent people to take care of the few that you specifically ordered." The butler quickly stepped forward and replied softly. "Where is Duke now?" "Just half an hour ago. He was chatting with the chairman of the Wade Merchant Group in the front hall, and now he's happily chatting with the sisters at the Grapevines in the parlor." "Where's Burrell?" 15 minutes ago. He was dancing with Madame Chevalier in the front hall, and now he's in guest room 7. "Where's Dreisack?" "He's been drinking with Knight Thomas and Knight Raoul in the side hall, and it's said that he's already drunk 6 bottles of grape wine. I've already sent another 5 bottles. You've done well." The nobleman nodded in satisfaction. Just as the nobleman was about to step into the front hall, the respectful butler suddenly pulled him back. "Master, I have another piece of news to report to you." "Oh? What news?" the nobleman asked in surprise. "Knight Collier is here?" "Collier? You mean the Knight of Radiance, Collier?" The nobleman was shocked, and he blurted out. He then lowered his head and smiled sinisterly, and without hesitation, strode out. Since even the Knight of Radiance had come, there was no reason for him, the master, to not show up. Moments later, a banquet attendant announced loudly outside the door. "Count Winlier has arrived." Countless black shadows swayed, and countless wizard beasts roared under the flickering light of the torches. The crowd ran at high speed, their heavy panting could be heard clearly. Crimson clouds of fire rolled in the sky, and meteorites wrapped in scorching flames fell from the sky. Every time they fell, it was accompanied by a violent roar and blinding flames. Then, the forest started to tremble. Every time this happened, even Duke couldn't help but shiver along with the forest. Because what followed was a terrifying shockwave of flames and a blanket of tree debris, mud, and debris. The meteorites that exploded in the sky would turn into a rain of fire, engulfing the entire forest. The only thing Duke could do was to put up an energy shield and use it to block the rain of fire. Amidst the tremors, he ran with all his might, and ran with all his might. Suddenly, an ugly and nauseating pale monster leaped out from the bushes by the roadside, pouncing on the demon hunter knight in front of Duke, and started gnawing on him. When Duke raised his ruined sword with trembling hands, the ghoul suddenly looked up at him, crouched down, and leaped high into the air, pouncing on him viciously. Looking at the terrifying fangs rapidly enlarging in front of him, Duke screamed and woke up from his nightmare. He sat up on the bed. The two naked ladies on the bed murmured a few words, turned over, and fell into a deep sleep. Duke wiped the cold sweat off his forehead and looked around the room. Only then did he realize that he was no longer in the terrifying battlefield, but in a warm nest. Duke couldn't help but smile as he recalled the crazy and charming moments of the first half of the night. He raised his head and wanted to lie back into the embrace of the beauty. But for some reason, he had a vague feeling that something dangerous was lurking around him. But after enjoying himself with wine and beauties, even his consciousness and sensitivity to danger had fallen to the lowest point. Just as he was at a loss and did not know where this strange fear came from, two red lights suddenly lit up in the darkness of the room. The red lights appeared very suddenly, and without him realizing it, they had already arrived in front of him and instantly attracted his attention. For some reason, when Duke's gaze landed on the red lights, his thoughts stopped moving. Even though he felt something was wrong, his willpower that had been weakened by multiple methods could not withstand the invasion of the red lights. Duke's face showed a painful expression, but he could not shift his gaze away from the red lights. As the strange fluctuations appeared in the red light, his mind sank deeper and deeper, and the expression on his face became calmer and calmer. Finally, he became completely silent. "All right, Blood Lady, this guy is under my control. It's all up to you now." In the darkness, a sweet female voice rang out. Thank you, Lady Phantom. When we get back, I will send the things you want to you as soon as possible. There are two more that I need to trouble you with." Mary's voice also rang out in the darkness. The female wizard named Phantom left the room, leaving the poor prey, whose mind and spirit had been enchanted by the illusion, to Mary. For a long time, Mary only had a group of quasi-sorcerer vampires in Blue Hill City. She had never successfully tested it on a powerful demon hunter knight, not to mention a magic-breaking knight with a higher willpower and magic resistance. So, taking advantage of this great opportunity, Mary paid a huge price to hire Phantom to help her break the defense of the magic-breaking knights and shake their willpower. This way, even if Mary's embrace failed, under the cover of the illusion, the magic-breaking knights would only see it as a new kind of nightmare and would not easily expose the secret of the Rose Manor. Chapter 219. Inside a hidden crypt at the edge of the Greenland forest. Tangled bushes covered the narrow entrance tightly. A black-shelled, green-winged carrion beetle with livor mortis spots on its back flew close to the top of the tall grass. Its 4 pairs of blade-like appendages were still impaling a dead human on its body. Judging from the human's attire and appearance, it should be a low-level mercenary who had entered the Greenland forest for a bounty. The carrion beetle circled around the entrance, and when it did not find anything out of the ordinary, it retracted its wings and landed near the entrance of the crypt. Soon, it dragged the mercenary's body into the crypt, and there was no longer any movement. After entering the crypt, the carrion beetle had to go through a winding and narrow tunnel to reach a giant crypt 20 meters below the ground. The crypt had become a giant hive. The ground and the walls were covered with a strange fungal carpet. It was soft to the touch, and one could step on it, but it was unusually tough, and had a strong resistance to acid and corrosive toxins. At the center of the crypt were more than 10 mounds of earth that looked like ant hills. However, the material used to build them wasn't ordinary earth, but rather the filthy substance formed from the mixture of human flesh and dregs, wood shavings, and wet soil. The surface of the mounds was densely packed with dark holes, and upon closer inspection, one could vaguely see the strange larvae wriggling inside. Although they were only larvae, their ear-piercing screeches, ugly appearance, and short but terrifying form were all signs that they were terrible creatures that the world could not tolerate. The carrion beetle that flew and hovered in the air above the crypt, and when it flew above one of the hives, its sickle-like appendages moved wildly. The human mercenary's body was immediately torn into pieces, and warm blood was poured onto the hive. Smelling the fresh blood, the larvae in the hive immediately screeched agitatedly, poking out their translucent white heads from the holes, crazily devouring the flesh and blood residue at the mouth of the crypt. The rest of the insect nests that didn't get any food let out even more ear-piercing hisses, causing the entire cave to be so noisy that people almost couldn't hear them. As the carrion beetles moved in and out of the nest, the fresh blood from the water rack continued to water them. Finally, the larvae dug a hole in one of the nests. More than 20 carrion beetle larvae crawled out, crawling on the creep carpet to undergo their first important evolution. Their milky white translucent shells began to solidify and harden as soon as they came into contact with the damp and cold air. Following a series of terrifying cracking sounds, a crack gradually appeared on their backs that ran through the entire spine and slowly expanded to both sides. When the crack widened to a certain extent, a ferocious insect head suddenly poked out from inside and let out the first metallic screech towards this icy cold world. In a dark forest dozens of miles away, the demonic worm in Titch was looking coldly at a human mercenary team that was advancing cautiously through the mottled shadows of the trees. As if he had heard the buzzing sounds coming from afar, Titch suddenly turned around and flashed a sinister smile in the direction of the nest. Within the wizard camp, the war wizard's tower was growing at an alarming speed. In just a dozen days, the war wizard's tower, which was 213 meters tall and had 2 levels underground and 7 levels above ground, had already been completed. It was now in the 10th stage of modifying the wizard's spells. After all, the simple war wizard's tower did not use any special, valuable stone materials. Instead, it only used the most ordinary mountain rocks and loose gravel solidified by wizard spells. Such a material would definitely not be able to withstand the harsh tests of war. Just the terrifying weight of the wizard's pagoda was enough to crush the foundation at the bottom of the wizard's pagoda into dust, much less a large-scale attack from the battle techniques of the knights. Thus, as the wizard's pagoda grew taller, a dozen wizards had been carving sturdy wizard formations on every giant stone slab of the wizard's pagoda day and night to increase the carrying capacity of these stones. Furthermore, these temporary wizard formations could not hinder the overall defense of the wizard's pagoda. Thus, the position where each wizard formation should be carved and how they should intersect with each other might seem simple, but it was not something that any wizard could accomplish. Other than the construction of the war wizard's pagoda, the busiest place in the camp was the wizard beast synthesis laboratory. Large groups of wild beasts from the forest were sent back to the camp from afar. Within an hour, they would turn into wizard beasts of all shapes and sizes, swarming into the forest in groups of 3 to 5. The protection of the perimeter of the camp was handed over to the elite ghouls. Each of them had abilities no weaker than a high-level apprentice. They were a group of tireless sentries, hiding in the bushes, or treetops. Any living being with the scent of a human would not be able to get within 3 miles of the camp. Other than these regular troops, there were also a few wizards with strange abilities active at the edge of the forest, monitoring the movements around them day and night. Those who would recklessly barge into the forest for a bit of bounty and land never stepped out of the forest again. In the previous battle, the thing that caused the greatest damage to the large group of magic knights was the plague bacteria. It was precisely because of the existence of the bacteria that could corrode rune energy and magic colts that the magic hunters became pitiful foot soldiers, losing the advantage of being able to roam the forest like the wind. Of course, such an effective thing had to be put to good use. After a period of improvement and cultivation, a more contagious plague toadstool had been created and passed to the spies in Blue Hills City through secret means. If it was not to avoid provoking the other party to make a move in advance, with the means of the wizards, Blue Hill City would have become a dead city with graves everywhere. In the camp outside Blue Hill City, the number of magic hunters was growing rapidly every day. It seemed that the powerful forces behind this plane had realized the danger of the wizards and were frantically hoarding the strongest forces. Furthermore, through secret channels, the Magus camp had also received news that the strongest person in this plane, the Grade 4 Holy Knight Willis, had already invited reinforcements from the mysterious Dragon Valley and was rushing over here day and night. It could be imagined that the moment he arrived here, it would be the moment when all the magic hunters would come out of their nest. Therefore, what the higher-ups of both sides could do was to constantly strengthen their own strength and consolidate their advantages. The two camps of magic hunters and wizards were like two madly accelerating chariots, approaching each other at a terrifying speed. Perhaps in the next second, they would collide head-on without holding back. As for who would win and who would lose, no one knew. The only thing that was known was that this was destined to be a war of life and death. 21 days had passed since the bloody battle in the forest. On a sunny afternoon, the opportunity for the war had silently arrived. Grimm, who was quietly conducting his witchcraft laboratory in the underground labyrinth, suddenly had a thought and took out a communication crystal from his pocket. The crystal was flashing with a blinding light. Grimm's spirit penetrated it, and Forgan's cold and harsh voice immediately rang in his mind. All wizards, return to camp immediately. All wizards, return to camp immediately. Those who do not return within an hour will be executed as traitors. Also, Crow, Plague, and Blood Lady continue to hide according to the original plan and await further orders. The war had finally arrived. Grimm's heart sank. No Magus dared to guarantee their own safety in a planar war of this scale. Even Lord Forgan, who was a calm commander, had a high chance of dying here. After all, once the war started, he would definitely become the target of the other plane's expert. As for the two level 3 wizards, even though they had been here for some time, they had never stepped out of the war wizard's pagoda. Who knew how much power they could unleash under the powerful suppression of the plane? After all, a level 1 wizard would need a day and a night to completely adapt to the laws of the plane, while a level 2 wizard would need 5 to 7 days. How long would it take for a powerful wizard to become a level 3 wizard? Filled with doubts, Grimm hastily packed up everything in the underground labyrinth and left with a flame leap. In various parts of the forest, a few wizards who were busy with their own tasks received Lord Forgan's message. They hurriedly abandoned their work and ran towards the direction of the camp. After receiving the message, the demonic worm Endic did not rush back, instead rushing to the area where the crypt was. When his figure, hidden under a heavy robe, appeared at the entrance of the crypt, a strange sound came from within. Following that, one by one, sinister-looking carrion beetles crawled out of the crypt and gathered around Endic. They raised their heads and let out sharp hisses. Endic's head, hidden under the shadow of his hood, also let out sharp hisses, as if communicating with the group of carrion beetles. 39 carrion beetles. Every single one of them had terrifying strength no weaker than a quasi-wizard. If they were to gather into an army, all the rank 1 magi would have no choice but to flee for their lives. Sweeping his gaze across the loyal insect soldiers around him, Entic finally felt a sense of exaltation in his heart. Damn Mary, damn Grimm, Now that my army of bugs has taken shape, let's see what else you can compare to me with? With a tinge of satisfaction in his heart, Intik strode toward the camp. The black-shelled, green-winged carrion beetles soared into the sky, their wings flapping rapidly as they flew above the treetop. They were like a giant dark cloud, following closely behind Endik. In the sky, some were sitting on giant flying magical creatures, some had green wings of wind on their backs, some had transformed into ferocious beasts and were running wildly. In an instant, the wizards scattered throughout the forest were all rushing towards the same place. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.